Hey there, friends. Tonight's tale is a little spooky. Not the jump scare kind. No clowns, no chainsaws. Just the quiet kind of fear. The kind that creeps in when the candles burn low and the wind rattles the shutters. The kind that medieval people knew all too well. We're heading back to a world without streetlights, where every shadow had meaning, every creak might be an omen, and something as simple as a cat crossing your path could send you to prayer. This story isn't about monsters in the way we think of them today. It's about beliefs, dark, deep ones, that haunted people long after the sun went down. It's about curses, restless spirits, whispering woods, and the invisible rules you had to follow, or else. Now, before we begin, if you enjoy these slow, softly spoken history rambles that help you drift off while learning something strange, go ahead and like this video. And if you're new here, welcome to the village. Tap subscribe and settle in for weekly bedtime stories that are boring on purpose, soothing by design, and just eerie enough to keep you interested. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Is it dark where you are? Are you tucked in under a cozy blanket, sipping something warm, or just staring into the dark, letting your thoughts wander? Whatever the case, let it be quiet now. Dim the lights. Let the hush of night settle in like fog over the moors. Take a deep breath and follow me back to a time when sleep didn't come easy, because the night held too many secrets. This is the story of the dark beliefs that kept medieval people awake. Let's begin. The fire has burned low now and the air has changed. Something ancient, almost instinctive, tells us that the night is different. More than just an absence of light, night in the medieval world was a threshold, a door, not just to sleep, but to something else entirely, to danger, to uncertainty, and in many hearts, to the dead. Medieval people did not see night as neutral. It wasn't just the time after sunset when chores were done and bodies rested. It was, quite literally, another realm. A place where the veil between this world and the next grew thin. You didn't just walk through a village after dark, you braved it. You didn't merely sleep, you hoped to wake. Before the age of electric lights and doorbell cameras, true darkness was a force of its own. Most homes had no windows in the modern sense. If a candle sputtered out or a lantern tipped over, it could mean hours of thick blackness pressing against every wall. Add to that the long winter nights, sometimes 14 or 15 hours of pitch, and suddenly just waiting for morning felt like a very vulnerable thing to do. In this darkness, fear wasn't abstract. It had names, shapes, stories passed down beside hearths or whispered behind hands. The dead, it was said, did not sleep soundly, especially those who had died violently, unconfessed, or buried improperly, a baby not baptized, a traveller killed without rites, a woman accused of witchcraft. These souls, many believed, might not find rest. The church taught that souls lingered in purgatory, and sometimes, just sometimes, they reached across the veil. Medieval ghost stories weren't the gory apparitions of modern horror movies. They were quiet, pale, drifting. But they were also cold, and they always brought messages. Some warned of danger, others begged for prayers, and many, unsettlingly, didn't speak at all. The dead might appear in the corners of rooms, on moonlit paths, or reflected in a basin of still water. To see one was not merely a fright, it was a summons to act. Offer alms, light candles, say masses. Fix what was wrong in the living world so the spirit could move on. Until then, you might hear their steps outside your door. Or find their footprint in the ash. This fear wasn't confined to folklore. Monks recorded such sightings in annals. Priests preached sermons warning about disturbed graves, and communities developed rituals to keep the dead where they belonged. Graves were sometimes weighed down with stones. Windows were sprinkled with holy water. Candles were kept burning, not just for light, but to protect. And so the night became a test of faith, of courage, of whether you had done right by the departed. A family might say evening prayers, cross themselves and bolt the door, but still listen for strange sounds beneath the wind. A creak of a timber, a cry of a night bird, or something softer, like bare feet on soil. Not all spirits were malicious, of course. Some were simply lost. But lost or not, they had power. And in the silence of midnight, as dogs refused to bark and firewood cracked unnaturally in the hearth, that power could be felt. To be awake at night in the medieval world was to be aware of your soul, of your sins, of every loved one you'd ever lost and every promise you'd left unfulfilled. No wonder people feared the dark. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the presence of memory, of the beyond, of things that watched. And so, with candles clutched tight and rosaries worn smooth with use, people did what they could. They kept their dead close, in prayers, in rituals, in stories, but not too close, never too close. The night belonged to the spirits, and all you could do was wait for dawn. As the night settled in and the fear of spirits thickened like fog, medieval communities had one consistent and tangible tool to push back against the unseen: the ringing of church bells. Not just for marking the hours or calling the faithful to prayer, these chimes had a specific and deeply superstitious purpose: driving away demons, restless souls, and anything else that might be lurking in the encroaching dark. Bells were not simply considered instruments of sound, they were spiritual weapons. In the medieval mind, sound itself had power, and among all earthly sounds, the solemn toll of a consecrated bell was believed to be one of the most potent. When dusk approached and the last rays of light dipped behind the trees or the horizon, the bell tower came to life. Its tolls echoed across fields and rooftops, drifting into valleys, forests, and graveyards. The ritual had a name: the curfew bell, from the Old French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. Practically, it signalled to villagers to extinguish hearth flames, settle in for the night to prevent fires. But spiritually, it carried a more urgent function. The evening bell was meant to cloak not just fire, but fear. Its ringing was a boundary, a barrier of sound to ward off malevolent spirits who, it was believed, gained strength as the sun fell. Church authorities encouraged this practice not merely out of religious discipline, but because the people feared what might move in darkness. Demons, according to medieval Christian belief, were not merely abstract beings. They were real, physical entities that prowled, tempted, and even attacked. And they were believed to be more active at night. The bell, often referred to as the voice of God or the tongue of the church, was blessed during its casting and anointed with holy water, salt, and oil. Special ceremonies were held to baptize bells, giving them names, dedicating them to saints, and praying over their ability to protect the community. This was not symbolic, it was considered essential. A bell that had not been properly consecrated might ring in vain. Each evening, the bell's toll acted as a kind of sonic exorcism. Its vibrations, carried on the air, were believed to disrupt the movement of spirits. Just as incense might purify a room or holy water bless a doorway, the bell cleansed the village atmosphere. It warned demons and witches alike, you are not welcome here. The belief extended to storms, plagues, and sudden deaths, events that were often interpreted as supernatural in origin. In times of crisis, bells were rung longer and louder. The deeper the fear, the more urgent the tolling. Entire communities would pause, heads bowed or eyes lifted toward the tower, listening for comfort and protection. This fear wasn't confined to the laity. Monasteries also practiced evening ringing as part of Compline, the final prayer of the day. But even monks, well-read, literate, steeped in theology, knew that the faithful feared what couldn't be seen, and so they tolled not only for devotion, but for defence. Over time, regional variations emerged. In some places, the bell was rung 3 times at dusk, once for the Trinity. In others, it was struck 9 times or until darkness fully fell. Whatever the rhythm, the symbolism remained. The bell was a shield of sound. This wasn't limited to Europe. Similar practices occurred across Christendom, with different cultures adopting the bell as a sacred protector. Its reach was universal, its role unquestioned. And so, just as villagers locked their doors and whispered prayers, they also listened. They waited for the sound that meant the boundaries were being drawn, that someone somewhere was watching the dark and ringing against it. It's easy to dismiss it now as superstition, but in a world with no electric light, no central security, no clear separation between myth and truth, the bell was certainty. Audible, dependable, consecrated certainty. When the bells rang at dusk, the people felt less alone, and that sometimes was all they needed to make it through the night. If church bells at dusk were meant to mark the end of the day and drive demons away, then what happened after midnight when the bells fell silent was left to the darkness. The protective sounds stopped. People had long gone to bed, and the world, already full of worry, became far more unsettling in its silence. For many in medieval Europe, it wasn't just that night was dark. It was that the darkest part of night had a name, a time, and a purpose. This was known as the Devil's Hour. Today we associate 3 a.m. with insomnia and strange dreams, but in the Middle Ages, this early hour had terrifying spiritual implications. It was believed to be the time when the boundary between the living and the dead was at its thinnest, when demons, ghosts, witches, and even the devil himself were most active. Unlike midnight, which had symbolic and liturgical ties to prayer and ritual, 3 a.m. was understood as its opposite, a time of spiritual vulnerability. The reasoning was partly religious. In Christian tradition, 3 p.m. was considered the hour of Christ's death on the cross, a holy and redemptive moment. As a mirror, 3 a.m. became the inversion of that event. If Jesus had died at 3 p.m., then 3 a.m. was the hour that belonged to the forces of darkness. This idea gained traction in sermons and local law alike. Priests warned of the hour's danger. Monks in cloisters may have risen to pray during nighttime hours, but lay people were often told to remain asleep, doors locked, candles out, and minds focused on God. In folklore, the Devil's Hour was when evil deeds were done. It was the hour of witches and nocturnal sorcery, of secret births and hidden crimes. Midwives often spoke of unlucky births that began or ended at 3 a.m, with fears that children born during this time might carry a spiritual mark or be cursed with misfortune. Villagers who died in that hour were sometimes whispered about long afterward. Had they been claimed by God or something else? Sleepwalking, too, was regarded with suspicion. If someone was found wandering the halls or fields during the 3rd hour, it wasn't always to restlessness. They might be bewitched, possessed, or worse, serving as a vessel for spirits too impatient to wait for dawn. This wasn't a time to leave your bed or walk between buildings. To do so risked encountering something you couldn't explain and might not survive. And if you were already awake, many people turned to prayer, even quietly and alone, to guard against the spirits believed to be lurking. Crossing oneself before returning to sleep was common. Placing a protective object, like a crucifix, relic, or blessed coin under a pillow offered psychological comfort, if not spiritual protection. Some households kept holy water by the bedside. Others simply covered mirrors, locked chests, or whispered old rhymes learned from grandmothers who'd seen one too many shadows behave strangely at that hour. Animals were not exempt from this fear. Roosters that crowed too early were said to have seen something unnatural. Cats that acted oddly at 3 a.m. were suspected of being in league with spirits, or at least of sensing what humans could not. Even dogs, normally trusted protectors, were said to howl at invisible intruders passing by. When dogs howled at night without cause, some believed it was a sign that death had crossed the threshold. Importantly, these beliefs weren't just church doctrine, they were lived experiences. When you live in a world lit only by fire and governed by strict hierarchies of belief, the night can feel like another world entirely. A quiet knock at the door, a thud on the roof, a creaking floorboard. These things took on spiritual weight when they occurred during the Devil's Hour. People may not have had modern clocks, but they could feel the shift in air, in silence, in instinct. Stories passed from one generation to the next confirmed the sense that 3 a.m. wasn't just another part of the night. It was the part no one talked about unless they had to. And so they slept lightly, prayed quietly, and waited, not for morning exactly, but for the hour to pass, because no one wanted to be awake when it arrived, and even fewer wanted to remember what they saw if they were. If 3 a.m. was considered the most dangerous hour in the medieval night, then people didn't just pray their way through it, they fortified themselves against it. When spiritual danger was believed to creep into the world after dark, physical actions took on a deeper, almost sacred meaning. Bolting a door wasn't just for thieves, closing a window wasn't just for wind. These acts became part of a nightly ritual meant to hold the darkness and everything believed to dwell in it firmly outside. In medieval Europe, homes were rarely built for comfort. Most villagers lived in small timber or wattle and daub cottages, with little insulation and no real security. But what these homes lacked in luxury, people tried to make up for with preparation. As the sun went down, households moved into defensive mode, not against armies, but against spirits, demons, and other night-bound threats. Doors were shut early, and in places where there weren't locks in the modern sense, people used wooden beams or iron bars to secure entrances from the inside. In wealthier households, heavy iron locks or sliding bolts might be installed. But for peasants, a simple wooden beam dropped into brackets on either side of the door could serve the same purpose. This wasn't just a precaution against intruders, it was believed to be an act of spiritual protection. After all, the devil, witches and wandering souls didn't need keys. They needed invitation, or an open path. Windows too were secured. Shutters made of wood were closed tightly and latched or even nailed shut if needed. Curtains were rare among the poor, but the act of covering or shielding a window still carried meaning. Moonlight was beautiful, yes, but it could also be a channel. There were beliefs that certain spirits, particularly those with malicious intent, travelled on moonbeams or could be drawn in by uncovered openings. If a window was left open after dusk, some feared it might welcome a wandering soul into the home. Better then to bar the opening, draw a cloth across it, or at least hang a blessed item near the frame. Household thresholds held special significance. Many families placed protective charms near or on their doors. This might include herbs such as St. John's wort, rosemary, or vervain, plants believed to ward off evil. In some areas, horse hose were nailed above the doorframe, not for luck as we might say today, but for protection. Their iron composition and curved shape were thought to repel witches or ill-intentioned spirits. Salt might be sprinkled across the threshold. Iron objects, nails, scissors, or small tools were sometimes placed near the door or under the mat to repel malevolent forces. These weren't just superstitions in the abstract, they were woven into daily life. When you lived in a world where spirits were not metaphorical but real and near, every act of domestic routine could become a ritual of defence. Inside the home, protective objects were also placed strategically. A blessed cross above the bed, a candle left burning for a time in winter months, a relic, if the family had one, tucked into the rafters. In wealthier homes, fragments of saints' bones or cloth said to be touched by holy figures might be kept in locked boxes. In rural households, the protection might be humbler, a mother's whispered prayer as she tucked in her children, or a woven charm hidden beneath the hearthstone. Even chimneys were a concern. They were entry points, holes that connected the inside to the outside world. In folklore, witches and spirits could enter a home this way, particularly during certain seasons or feast days when the spiritual world was believed to be closer. Covering the chimney flue or hanging protective herbs nearby was a common precaution. The idea behind all of this was not just fear, it was containment. People couldn't control the night, but they could control their space. They couldn't stop spirits from roaming the woods or fields, but they could close the door, shutter the window, and surround themselves with meaning. Spiritual safety didn't just come from the church, it came from habit, ritual, and belief carried out with the hands. In the stillness of the medieval night, when the fire had burned low and the devil's hour loomed, those inside took comfort not only in prayer, but in the quiet strength of latched doors and shuttered windows. The house became not just a home, but a boundary, a fragile but determined line between the known and the unknown. But even with barriers in place, certain sounds could pierce through the illusion of safety. Chief among them was the cry of the owl. In the Middle Ages, the screeching owl was not simply a bird, it was an omen. More specifically, it was feared as a messenger of death. Its sudden cry in the dark, sharp, drawn out, and eerily human, could send chills through even the most rational of villagers. When that cry came from the rooftop or a nearby tree, the meaning was unmistakable. Someone in the house was marked. This belief was not isolated to one region. Across England, France, the German states, and beyond, the owl, particularly the barn owl or screech owl, was deeply associated with the supernatural. Its nocturnal habits, ghost-like face, and silent flight made it a creature of mystery. And in a time when mystery was often equated with danger, the owl took on a deeply sinister reputation. Peasant households, especially in rural villages, often passed down stories linking owl cries with impending death. If the owl screeched once, it was a warning. If it returned the next night, the warning had become a certainty. Folk healers, midwives, and priests alike were called upon to interpret the sign, though few offered comfort. Some might suggest prayers to Saint Michael or the sprinkling of holy water around the doorway. Others advised burning protective herbs, sage, yarrow or juniper, to cleanse the air of whatever spirit the owl might herald. But most simply prepared themselves, for in their eyes the owl did not cause death, it merely announced it. Interestingly, not all owls were viewed the same. The tawny owl, with its softer call, was seen as more neutral or even protective in some local traditions, but the white-faced barn owl, with its screech like a soul in agony, was almost universally feared. Its appearance, pale against the black sky, with dark forward-facing eyes, was said to resemble a ghost or demon. Farmers sometimes destroyed nests near their barns, fearing the creature would bring misfortune to their household or livestock. The association between owls and death may have had natural roots. Owls are opportunistic hunters, often drawn to the same environments as sickness, quiet homesteads, places with rodents, or areas where livestock or people had recently died. It is possible that their appearance coincided frequently with times of illness or famine, further reinforcing their reputation as omens. Yet the fear was not purely symbolic. There were documented cases of villagers acting on this belief. In parts of Eastern Europe, owls found nesting too close to a home might be hunted or trapped and nailed to barn doors, a grim attempt to ward off the death they were believed to bring. Such acts were not considered cruel at the time, but protective, necessary measures against unseen forces. Inside the home, families remained alert. If a relative was already ill, an owl's cry might be taken as a final sign. If everyone seemed well, it sparked anxious days of waiting. Children were hushed, visits from neighbours were curtailed, and in the following nights, every creak and shadow took on deeper meaning. A death that followed, even weeks later, was often remembered in relation to the owl's cry. The creature became part of the story, its call remembered not just as background noise, but as prophecy fulfilled. In a world where science had little reach and fear of the supernatural ran deep, such beliefs gave structure to chaos. The screeching owl perched on the roof was not merely a bird, it was a bridge between this life and whatever waited beyond, and when its cry cut through the silence, no door felt truly closed, no wall truly thick. The night had sent its warning, and when its cry cut through the silence, no door felt truly closed, no wall truly thick. The night had sent its warning. Yet the owl was not the only creature feared for its voice in the dark. The long, mournful howl of a dog, especially at night, carried its own weight in dread. In medieval Europe, dogs were not just guardians of home and field. They were believed to possess a sensitivity to death itself. When a dog howled without cause, particularly at a door or window, it was widely believed to be a sign that a soul was departing or had already departed. This belief cut across regional boundaries. In English villages, it was said that a dog howling under a window foretold a death in that household. In parts of Germany, the howling of a dog was called death howling, and often associated with the passage of spirits. In the French countryside, there were tales of spectral hounds that roamed at night, accompanying death as it made its rounds. Even in clerical writings, dogs were sometimes acknowledged as uncanny witnesses to invisible movements of the soul. The cause of this fear was not only cultural, but behavioural. Dogs, unlike people, did not sleep through the night so easily. They stirred, barked and howled in response to noises humans could not hear. A dog's howl, long, wavering and oddly human-sounding, seemed to echo with grief or forewarning. When it came during the devil's hour just before dawn, it gained even more significance. If multiple dogs howled in unison, villagers might murmur that the procession of the dead was passing unseen. For peasant households, this belief shaped nightly routines. A howling dog was not simply hushed, it was watched. Was the animal staring at a particular door? Was it growling or whining between howls? Did it paw at the earth or the threshold? Such behaviours were analysed with quiet urgency. If the dog was the family's own, it might be kept indoors, soothed or even prayed over. But if the sound came from outside, from a roaming stray or a neighbour's animal, there was little comfort to be found. The house might be sprinkled with holy water. A candle might be lit for protection. In extreme cases, a priest might be asked to bless the home if the howling persisted. There were efforts to rationalise the behaviour even then. Some said that dogs could smell illness or death, detecting a change in the human body long before it was visible. Others believed that animals were simply more attuned to the spiritual world, creatures without sin, capable of seeing what humans could not. This belief was particularly common in areas with a strong monastic presence. Monks who wrote bestiaries often gave dogs dual symbolism, both protectors and harbingers, faithful yet fearful. In folk traditions, the interpretation was more direct. A dog howling at night was not sensing a future death. It was responding to one already in progress. It was said the animal could see the soul as it left the body, or the spirit that had come to collect it. This tied closely to the medieval belief in death as a physical event, not merely an absence of life, but a transition marked by movement, sound, and even visitation. The dog's howl in this context was not just a noise, it was a reaction to the sacred or profane moment of passing. There were even stories of dogs refusing to enter certain rooms after a death, or lying beside a grave for days, howling until they fell silent. These behaviours reinforced the belief that dogs were bound to human spirits in ways not entirely understood. Some families treated them with added reverence, especially in their old age. Others, more superstitious, viewed them with suspicion, particularly if they howled frequently or without apparent reason. Over time, the howling dog became part of the medieval soundscape of dread. Just as the owl warned from the roof, the dog mourned at the door. Its cry was not merely an annoyance or a call for attention. It was a signal that something unseen had shifted, that the veil between life and death had fluttered, and once heard it could not be easily forgotten. For those huddled inside, listening with held breath, the howling was not just noise, it was the sound of a soul being taken. For those huddled inside, listening with held breath, the howling was not just noise, it was the sound of a soul being taken. But not all omens came from the world outside. Some were felt beneath the skin. In a time before modern medicine and neurology, the body itself was seen as a message board, an instrument through which fate, spirits, or divine forces could signal what was to come. An unexplained twitch, an itch in a specific bodily sensation might be read as a warning, a blessing, or a shift in fortune. Among the most commonly interpreted were itchy palms and twitching eyes. Itchy palms, for instance, had layered meanings depending on the side and the context. In much of medieval Europe, an itch in the right palm was said to mean that money was coming, silver or coin soon to be placed in hand. But an itch in the left palm was often believed to mean the opposite, that money would soon be leaving one's possession, perhaps due to unexpected costs or a debt being called in. These beliefs were passed down through families and embedded in everyday conversation. A labourer might pause in his work, rub his hand and mutter, "A coin for the pocket soon," or, more grimly, "Best tighten the purse strings." Though these sayings were technically folk beliefs, they were treated with seriousness by many, especially among the rural poor. In a world where economic security was fragile and even a few coins could mean the difference between hunger and warmth, the body's warnings were not dismissed lightly. Some people even developed habits around these superstitions, rubbing the itchy palm against wood to ensure the money would stay, or spitting into it to break the curse of coming loss. Twitching eyes carried their own set of meanings. A right eye twitch, particularly in men, was often interpreted as a good sign, a coming visitor, a message, or unexpected news. A left eye twitch, however, was commonly seen as a bad omen, arguments, illness, or bad luck on the horizon. In women, the associations were sometimes reversed, depending on region or household tradition. Because such sensations could not be seen by others, they were highly personal, and often shared quietly between friends or family members. A mother might warn her daughter to stay home from the market if her eye had twitched that morning. A wife might light a candle for protection if her husband reported a sudden itch in his hand before setting out on a journey. These were not just old wives' tales, they were lived frameworks for understanding the unpredictable world. The Church, predictably, took a sceptical view. Superstitions that ascribed meaning to bodily sensations without reference to divine will were seen as bordering on paganism. Priests might remind parishioners that the devil, too, could play tricks on the body. A twitch, they warned, was not always a message. It'd be a temptation, a distraction, or even a demonic provocation. But these warnings had limited effect. When patterns of body and fate seemed to repeat, when a twitch was followed by misfortune or an itch by a coin, people remembered, and they passed those memories on. In the medieval worldview, the soul and body were not wholly separate. What happened to one could influence the other. Thus, it made sense that the body might speak through signs. Goosebumps, in the absence of cold, sudden shivers or hot flushes, were also interpreted as messages, often signs that someone had just spoken of you or that a spirit had passed nearby. Monastic scholars occasionally recorded such beliefs in their margins, even while mocking them. A 12th century English chronicler noted, with faint amusement, that villagers in his region would delay important decisions if someone's left palm itched at sunrise. A French herbal manuscript warned that persistent twitches might indicate not illness, but spiritual imbalance, best corrected with prayer, fasting, and a mild infusion of mugwort. Ultimately, these superstitions were not just curiosities, they were systems. In a society where literacy was limited and formal knowledge inaccessible, the body became a form of everyday divination. It required no books, no training, just attentiveness. And for those living on the edge of survival, any warning, even one written in nerves and skin, was worth heeding. Because in the medieval mind, the world was never silent, and neither was the body. But even more mysterious, and sometimes more feared, were the messages delivered not in waking hours, but in dreams. To the medieval imagination, sleep was not a time of rest alone. It was a threshold, and dreams, especially disturbing or vivid ones, were viewed not simply as the mind's wanderings, but as windows into the future. A nightmare might be a warning. A restless vision might point to sin, sickness, or approaching death. Dreams that seemed especially clear or unsettling were treated with care. If someone woke pale-faced and shaken, those closest to them would ask what they had seen. Dreams involving falling teeth, dark animals, shadowy figures, or funeral processions were particularly dreaded. In many communities, it was believed that such dreams foretold death, either of the dreamer or someone close to them. This belief was not confined to peasants or isolated folklore. Medieval texts, from sermons to chronicles, are filled with references to dreams interpreted as omens. Chroniclers recorded the final dreams of kings and saints. Monks wrote about holy visions that came during sleep, and ordinary villagers told stories about people who had dreamed of their own burial, only to fall ill days later. While interpretations varied by region, there was a shared understanding that certain dream imagery carried weight. For example, dreaming of being submerged in water or drowning often suggested that the soul was in danger or that grief was approaching. A dream of a broken ladder or collapsing roof might signify that a household was soon to suffer loss. Dreaming of one's own death was not always seen as literal, but dreaming of a loved one dying, especially if they appeared sick or silent, was rarely dismissed. Many of these interpretations were passed down orally through family or community elders, but some came from written sources. Dream books, manuals for interpreting common dream symbols, circulated in monasteries and noble households, sometimes translated from older Greek or Arabic texts. Though most peasants could not read these works, the ideas within them filtered down through oral culture. A village midwife or local healer might know that dreaming of black birds meant sorrow, or that a burning field signalled calamity. These interpretations were not random, they were part of a larger framework in which dreams were messages from beyond. The Church's position on dreams was complex. On one hand, it recognised that some dreams might be sent by God as warnings, tests, or calls to repentance. Visions of saints or angels were recorded with reverence. But the Church also warned that many dreams came from the devil, meant to confuse or tempt. Nightmares filled with fear, lust, or chaos were viewed with suspicion. A dreamer might be told to confess their sins, to pray more fervently, or to fast in response to troubling visions. In some cases, recurring nightmares were believed to be the work of demons or wandering spirits, especially if the dreams involved suffocation, paralysis, or torment. Among ordinary people, the reaction to a death dream could be deeply personal. A mother might keep her children close for days after dreaming of an empty cradle. A farmer might avoid the fields after dreaming of a falling scythe. Some people sought guidance from local priests. Others turned to charms, herbs, or whispered prayers said upon waking. Mugwort was a common plant associated with dream protection, tied above the bed or steeped into a tea. Ashes from blessed candles might be sprinkled near the pillow to ward off evil visions. Importantly, dreams were not always taken at face value. It was the pattern, the repetition, that gave them weight. One strange dream could be ignored. 2 similar dreams in the same week, that was a sign. A third might send someone to confession, to the healer, or even to prepare for death. The power of dreams in the medieval world came from their liminality. They were not of this world, but not entirely separate from it. They occurred during sleep when the soul was thought to wander, and so they bore the possibility of truth. A dream could warn, a dream could haunt, a dream could foretell. And in a time when life and death sat closer together than we can imagine today, the whisper of a dream was often enough to change how a person lived the next morning. But there were some whose lives were shaped not by dreams they received, but by the fears others projected onto them. Chief among these were the wise women, midwives, herbalists, and folk healers who, for centuries, served their communities with knowledge passed down outside the walls of the church or university. These women were respected, relied upon, and often feared, because while their hands could ease childbirth or banish a fever, they could also, so some believed, curse a household, spoil the milk, or cause sickness with a glance. The line between healer and witch was not always clear in the medieval mind. For many villagers, the local wise woman was both, a woman of remedies and risk. She might be sought in desperation when a child burned with fever, when labour would not progress, or when animals grew thin without cause. She would arrive with bundles of herbs, whispered instructions, and rituals that blended Christian symbols with older folk practices. If healing followed, she was praised. If not, suspicion took root. This suspicion was always close to the surface, especially when her knowledge exceeded what others could explain. A remedy that worked too quickly. A prediction that came true, a touch that calmed a screaming infant. These were not seen purely as skill, they were uncanny, and in uncertain times the uncanny was dangerous. Tensions rose when her work crossed paths with misfortune. If a cow died after she walked past the pasture, if crops failed near a home she had visited, if a child, once healed, fell sick again weeks later, all of these could become evidence, not of error or chance, but of deliberate harm. People spoke of the wise woman's curse, a term that could mean anything from a muttered insult to a magical hex. In some places, it was said that to anger a healer was to invite ruin. This fear was sharpened by the church's growing stance on unapproved healing. While early medieval clergy often tolerated folk practices so long as they didn't challenge doctrine, later centuries saw increasing efforts to regulate spiritual authority. Healing that drew from saints or scripture was one thing. Healing through charms, moon phases, or old gods was another. As theological views hardened, those who practiced folk medicine risked being labelled heretics or worse. In some regions, laws were passed forbidding the use of magic arts in healing. These laws rarely distinguished between malicious sorcery and traditional medicine. The result was a rise in accusations, especially during periods of crisis. Plagues, famines, and unexplained deaths created fertile ground for scapegoats, and wise women, already marginal, already feared, were easy targets. Yet not all were accused by strangers. Often it was neighbours, those who had once sought their help, who turned on them. A remedy that failed, a payment disputed. A patient who died despite all efforts. These moments could sour relationships quickly. What had been healing now looked like harm, a blessing reinterpreted as a curse. Even among those not formally prosecuted, the threat of rumour was constant. A woman might find herself avoided in the market or whispered about near the church porch. Her children might be mocked, her home passed by in silence, and yet she might still be sought, quietly, after dark, by the same people who feared her. Records from ecclesiastical courts show a mix of accusations, some grounded in genuine fear, others in malice or envy. She laid her hands on my son, and he withered. She muttered words as she left, and our pigs died the next day. She looked at me strangely, and I bled for 3 weeks. In these statements, physical misfortune was tied to personal grievance. The wise woman became not just a figure of knowledge, but of blame. Despite all this, many continued their work. They treated fevers, bound wounds, and helped bring babies into the world. Some adjusted their language, framing their remedies in Christian terms, attributing healing to divine favour rather than personal skill. Others withdrew more deeply into secrecy, but all knew the risk they carried. Because in medieval life, healing was never just about medicine, it was about power, and power, especially in the hands of women, was always suspect. This suspicion reached its peak in the birthing chamber, where midwives worked at the threshold of life and death. Their role was essential. No physician attended the average village birth, and few men had knowledge or experience in such matters. Midwives were the ones who guided labour, delivered infants, tended to postpartum wounds, and when necessary baptised newborns too weak to survive. But this closeness to life, blood and pain also made them targets of fear. They were needed, but they were also reviled. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was fraught with risk. Maternal mortality was high. Infant death was common. A successful delivery was never guaranteed. When things went wrong, when the baby was born still or the mother bled out, it was rarely seen as chance. Someone had failed or someone had interfered. The midwife, central to the process, could be praised as a saviour or blamed as a sorceress, sometimes within the span of hours. The fear lay partly in what childbirth represented. It was a moment when the boundaries between the natural and the spiritual seemed thinnest. Women cried out in agony, blood flowed freely, prayers were whispered, candles were lit, and in the chaos of a difficult birth, gestures and murmurs took on heightened meaning. If a midwife spoke to herself while preparing herbs, if she drew a protective sign on the floor, or if she handled the afterbirth in a certain way, her actions could be interpreted not as ritual but as witchcraft. Complicating this were the midwife's tools and knowledge. Many used herbal remedies to ease pain, stimulate contractions, or stop bleeding. But these same herbs were also associated with magic or poison in other contexts. Pennyroyal, tansy, and mugwort, common in women's medicine, had double reputations as both healers and abortifacients. Handling them without clerical approval was risky. If a baby was born dead after the use of such plants, questions followed. Not just about the medicine, but about the midwife's intent. Then there was the issue of baptism. In remote villages or during night births, a midwife might be the only person present with the authority to perform an emergency baptism, a responsibility acknowledged, albeit reluctantly, by the church. If a newborn failed to draw breath, she would rush to sprinkle water and speak the words that might secure the infant's soul. But this temporary spiritual authority was not always welcomed by clergy. Midwives who spoke too confidently of their role in saving souls were watched with suspicion. After all, they were not ordained, and yet they acted at the edge of the sacred. These concerns intensified in later medieval and early modern periods as ecclesiastical and secular authorities moved to assert more control over reproductive matters. Midwives were increasingly subject to scrutiny, required to swear oaths of loyalty to the church, and in some cases to report suspected cases of illegitimacy, infanticide, or immoral behaviour. Their autonomy was reduced, but their burden remained. Accusations could emerge from almost any direction. A noble family might blame a village midwife for the loss of a long-awaited heir. A jealous neighbour might accuse her of stealing blood-soaked rags for spells. A woman whose labour was long and painful might, in the aftermath, recall the midwife's hands as cold or her words as strange. And in periods of heightened witch panic, these accusations could escalate rapidly, from whispers to denunciations to trials. Despite all this, most midwives were not feared by their communities. They were respected, trusted with the most intimate and dangerous of tasks. They were mothers, daughters, and grandmothers who had inherited their craft from older women, passing it down in turn. Their reputations were built over years of successful deliveries and quiet guidance. But that trust was conditional. It could be erased by a single tragedy, a stillborn child, or a poorly chosen word. In the end, midwives stood in a precarious position. They held knowledge others did not. They touched both life and death. They moved through spaces where men and priests rarely went. And in a culture where women's power was already constrained, that visibility was as dangerous as it was vital. Because to bring life into the world was holy work, but in the wrong eyes, it looked like something else entirely. That same fear of women who lived outside ordinary boundaries extended beyond the birthing room. In many villages, there was one figure whose mere presence could stir unease, the widow who lived alone, especially if her home stood on the edge of the settlement near the trees, away from the road. She may not have practiced healing or midwifery. She may have had no herbs, no clients, no charms, but her isolation was itself suspicious. In a world so tightly bound by community, the lone woman became an object of scrutiny. Widowhood in medieval Europe was a complicated state. In theory, a widow could hold more freedom than a married woman. She could manage property, make contracts, and even appear in court. But that freedom came with costs. Without the social protection of a husband, and with no sons or male relatives to buffer public opinion, widows were vulnerable, especially if they were poor or lived past childbearing age. They were often perceived as unnecessary to the community's core functions, no longer bearing children, no longer serving a husband, no longer under male supervision. If such a woman lived quietly at the edge of the woods, perhaps in a small croft inherited or built after her husband's death, she became an ideal candidate for suspicion. The forest itself was already a space of ambiguity in the medieval imagination. It was wild, dark, full of animals and spirits, and beyond the reach of law. To dwell near it, or in it, was to exist at the border of order and chaos. And if the person living there was an older woman with no daily visitors and little social standing, the assumptions followed. She was too quiet. She must be hiding something. She doesn't attend mass. She must be consorting with spirits. Her garden grows too well. What does she feed it? Why do her chickens never sicken? Why does she never fall ill? These murmurs could snowball quickly. A cow miscarried after grazing near her land. A child developed a fever after taking berries from her hedgerow. A man had a dream in which she appeared with black eyes. All of these were enough to begin a story, one that might grow beyond her ability to contain or correct. She had no family to defend her, no husband to speak on her behalf. Silence, once a survival strategy, became an accusation in itself. In many cases, these women lived uneventful lives, gathering wood, tending a few animals, and relying on seasonal work or the goodwill of neighbours to survive. But because they did not fit easily into the expected categories of maiden, wife, or mother, their presence questions. The idea that a woman might choose or be forced by circumstance to live alone was unsettling to a culture built on interdependence and patriarchal oversight. Clerical authorities sometimes echoed these suspicions. Though church teachings emphasised charity and the care of widows, local priests might still view reclusive women with unease, especially if they resisted regular attendance or confessed strange dreams. A solitary woman reading from a psalter might be seen as devout. A solitary woman murmuring over her hearth might be seen as dangerous. These suspicions were not confined to villages. In towns, widows who operated independently, running small shops, renting rooms, or serving as wet nurses, could also attract negative attention. But the rural widow in the woods occupied a special place in popular imagination. She was the one who might know the names of forgotten herbs, who might keep odd objects on her shelf, who might, in the minds of her neighbours, speak to something other than God. Many were left alone, even while being whispered about. But when famine struck, or disease spread, or a child died without clear cause, that fragile tolerance could break. Accusations might follow, not based on evidence, but on isolation, not on acts, but on presence. A presence that no longer made sense to those around her. And so the widow in the woods became a symbol of something feared, not because she did harm, but because she stood apart. In a world that demanded conformity and visibility, solitude looked suspicious. And for a woman who had already lost much, that suspicion could cost her everything. Once marked as different, whether by age, solitude, or circumstance, a woman had little room for error. The line between being tolerated and being accused was thin, and it did not always require wrongdoing. In many cases, it required only that she knew too much or said too little. Knowledge without credentials or silence in a world that demanded explanations could be just as damning as open defiance. And in the murmur of village gossip, one phrase carried particular weight. She speaks to spirits. This phrase could mean many things, and rarely meant any of them clearly. Sometimes it was a reference to visions or dreams. Other times it was applied to women who talked to themselves while working or who kept to strange habits. If she prayed too often and too privately, questions followed. If she claimed to know when someone would fall ill or where a lost object might be found, she was watched more closely. What made her certain? Who had told her? Women who interpreted dreams, gave herbal advice, or observed the weather patterns too accurately might be said to have a gift. But that gift, while occasionally useful, was unstable. It could be reframed at any time as unnatural. What was once wisdom could suddenly be rebranded as witchcraft. And in an environment where misfortune was always looking for a cause, an accused woman's words, no matter how benign, could be reinterpreted in hindsight as evidence of spiritual traffic. For some women, it was their very refusal to speak that invited suspicion. When tragedy struck and a neighbour remained silent or offered no opinion, it was assumed she knew something she wasn't saying. In this way, both knowledge and ignorance became suspicious. A woman who explained too much was clearly dabbling in forbidden things. A woman who explained nothing at all was clearly hiding something worse. It was a paradox from which there was little escape. Religious authorities often warned against claiming to receive messages outside of sanctioned visions. Prophets belonged to scripture, not to village lanes. And while saints were sometimes said to have heard voices or seen spirits, those stories were reserved for men and women under strict monastic control, not commoners tending goats or gathering firewood. When a woman claimed to hear voices, whether divine or otherwise, it challenged both religious and social order. Who gave her permission? What spirits answered when she called? If the voices told her true things, it was frightening. If they told her false things, it was dangerous. And either way, she had stepped beyond the boundaries of what was permitted. Some women, when accused, insisted they had never spoken to any spirit, holy, demonic, or otherwise. But this denial often fell on deaf ears. In times of famine, plague, or social unrest, entire communities looked for explanations, and supernatural causes, however illogical, offered a kind of comfort. If someone was responsible, then perhaps the world could be corrected. Many accused women were in reality simply observant. They knew who was feuding with whom. They noticed whose children coughed at night, or which field had failed to sprout. Years of watching, listening, and living closely with others made their predictions more accurate than chance. But accuracy, without clerical backing, was threatening. It blurred the line between wisdom and power. The phrase, "she speaks to spirits," became a weapon that required no evidence. It did not rely on what the woman did, but on how she was seen, alone too often, silent too long, a little too insightful, a little too odd. And once spoken aloud, the accusation lingered. Even when no charges were brought, the damage was done. She might be excluded from communal baking, her name might disappear from prayer lists, children might be told to avoid her door. And if anything strange happened, if a storm arrived early or a sheep turned lame, eyes turned in her direction. It was not always loud, this form of condemnation. More often it was quiet, relational, subtle. But in small villages, quiet exclusion could be more ruinous than open accusation. And so the women who had once been midwives, healers, or simply widows learned to walk carefully, to speak cautiously, to know but not to show it. Because, in a world that feared unseen forces, a woman didn't need to summon spirits to be feared. She only had to be the kind of person they might speak to. And in the quiet hours of the night, when even speaking aloud was rare, it was not just living people or saints that were imagined to draw near. The medieval mind made room for other visitors, dark ones whose presence was neither welcomed nor fully understood. Among the most feared were the incubi and succubi, demons believed to torment sleepers, invade dreams, and steal not just peace, but purity. Belief in these beings was widespread throughout medieval Europe, and while their names came from Latin, their presence was imagined in the most ordinary households. An incubus was a male demon said to lie upon women as they slept, often to seduce or assault them, while the succubus was the female counterpart, preying on men in the same vulnerable state. The line between nightmare sleep paralysis and spiritual attack was thin, and in an age where few understood the physiology of sleep, these nocturnal experiences were often interpreted as proof of demonic activity. Clerical texts and theological treatises frequently addressed the subject, not as metaphor, but as real danger. Incubi and succubi were said to be sent by the devil to tempt, corrupt, and even possess. They were not simply creatures of lust, but spiritual parasites. Victims might wake with bruises, with dishevelled bedclothes, or with sensations they could not explain. For those struggling with guilt, celibacy, or sexual repression, the demon offered both an excuse and a terrifying reality. The devil was not just tempting them during waking hours, but violating them in their sleep. Women were particularly vulnerable to accusations and suspicion in this context. A woman who suffered disturbing dreams, physical discomfort, or spiritual confusion might be told she had been visited by an incubus. Midwives and healers might offer protective herbs or prayers. Priests might recommend confession, penance, or exorcism. But in many cases, the woman's word was not enough to secure sympathy, especially if she was young and unmarried, or older and living alone. Monks and nuns, too, reported such attacks in cloisters and convents, adding religious weight to the belief. Accounts survive in which holy men described waking in terror, feeling pressure on their chest, or being unable to speak or move. In some cases, the demon was said to return repeatedly, weakening the body and clouding the mind. These stories reinforced the Church's warnings that no one was safe, not even the devout, if their spiritual defences were not properly maintained. Medical theories of the time did little to challenge the belief. The balance of humours, the influence of the moon, or excessive melancholy might be offered as partial explanations. But even physicians sometimes conceded that not all ailments had natural causes. The overlap between physical symptoms and spiritual suspicion was constant. If a man became exhausted, distracted, or impotent, a succubus might be blamed. If a woman experienced irregular bleeding, nightmares, or inexplicable bruising, an incubus was feared. Treatments varied depending on who was consulted. A priest might advise the reading of specific psalms, the wearing of relics, or sleeping with holy water under the bed. Folk remedies included hanging iron over the door, sprinkling salt across the threshold, or placing protective herbs like rue or fennel near the pillow. In more serious cases, an exorcism could be requested, though this was not easily obtained unless the victim was a member of the clergy or a person of standing. The fear of these demons extended beyond individual victims. Families might worry that a home was cursed. A child born under suspicious circumstances might be whispered about. Was the mother truly alone that night? Some claimed that incubi could father children, producing monstrous or deformed offspring. These beliefs further blurred the line between the supernatural and the everyday, making private suffering into public concern. At its core, belief in incubi and succubi revealed how the medieval world understood vulnerability. Nighttime was not merely dangerous because of thieves or wolves, but because of what could not be seen, fought, or explained. The body, even in sleep, was not safe. Desire, fear, and the demonic all mixed in ways that left few untouched, and so people prayed before bed, hung charms, whispered blessings into the darkness, because once the candle was out and the house was still, the body might rest, but the soul was never truly alone. Even in the deepest hours of sleep, danger could press inward, silent, invisible, and paralysing. While some spoke of demons like the incubus or succubus, others told of a different presence, a smothering spirit, an unseen weight that crushed the chest, stilled the limbs, and stole the breath. This was the night hag, a figure feared across medieval Europe as the cause of mysterious waking nightmares. In modern terms, it resembles what we now call sleep paralysis. But in the Middle Ages, it was something far more terrifying. It was a visitation. The experience was often reported in similar terms. A person would wake in the middle of the night, unable to move, unable to cry out. Their eyes might be open, yet their body was frozen. They felt a crushing weight on their chest as if someone was sitting upon them. Some described a presence, dark, feminine, crouched on the edge of the bed or straddling the rib cage. Others spoke of suffocation, of being strangled by unseen hands. In villages from Scandinavia to the British Isles, this experience was known by many names, but the explanation was often the same. A spirit or witch had come in the night to torment the sleeper. Unlike the incubus, which was often associated with temptation and sin, The night hag's attack was viewed as malevolent from the start. She was not seducing, she was harming, smothering, frightening, draining the very breath from the lungs. And where the incubus might come for both men and women, the night hag was often said to prey particularly on the vulnerable, the sick, the elderly, the newly widowed, or those already marked by suspicion. Her arrival was often taken as a sign of ill fortune or a curse already in motion. Clerics and physicians occasionally recorded such events, though their explanations varied. Some suggested the attacks were caused by overindulgence, indigestion, or unbalanced humours. Others pointed to demonic interference, particularly if the experience recurred. Church authorities rarely dismissed the fear outright. If a person complained of being attacked in the night, especially repeatedly, they might be told to confess, pray, or cleanse the home with holy water. Priests could bless the bed, recite protective psalms, or place a relic beneath the mattress. The presence of the night hag was interpreted not only as a supernatural threat, but as a possible sign of spiritual vulnerability. Among the laity, protective practices multiplied. People hung iron scissors above the bed, laid brooms at the door to confuse spirits, or placed protective herbs beneath their pillows, wormwood, St. John's wort, or elder. In some regions, sleepers kept shoes pointing toward the door to lead the spirit away if it entered. Others recited charms or prayers each night before, but not just for restful sleep, but to guard against the hag's return. The cultural power of this experience was magnified by its intensity. Victims did not simply wake frightened, they remembered it vividly. The sensation of weight, breathlessness, and paralysis felt all too real. And because sleep was understood as a time when the soul might wander or be reached by spiritual forces, such attacks were not considered hallucinations. They were visitations. Something or someone had entered the room. Stories of the night hag spread from home to home. In some tales, she was a cursed woman, condemned to torment sleepers. In others, she was a wandering spirit, seeking vengeance or sustenance. Her physical form was rarely described in detail, more often felt than seen. But when she was pictured, she was old, cloaked and wild-eyed. Some claimed she had animal features, long claws, goat's eyes, or the smell of rot. Others believed she could be sent by witches, summoned to punish or terrorize enemies while they slept. In a society where nighttime was already layered with spiritual danger, the night hag added another threat, one that entered the very bedchamber, one that could not be seen or stopped. And because her attacks were personal, physical, and repeated, they were deeply feared. Entire households might alter their sleeping arrangements in response. Children were moved, charms renewed, candles kept burning through the darkest hours. The smothering spirit blurred the line between dream and reality, spirit and flesh. For those who suffered her visitations, the memory did not fade with morning. It lingered, shaping their prayers, their habits, and their fears. Because once the night hag had come, the bed no longer felt safe, and the silence of sleep no longer promised peace. When a household could no longer explain away the fear, when the sounds, shadows, or afflictions grew too frequent, there was only one conclusion left. A demon had entered. It might have come through sin, through a cursed object, or by being named aloud too often. But regardless of the path, the presence had settled, and the only question that remained was how to get rid of it. In medieval Europe, the process of banishing a demon was never taken lightly. It required authority, ritual, and absolute seriousness. The Church held primary control over formal exorcism, and with that control came a strict hierarchy. Not every priest could perform the rite. It required episcopal approval in most cases, and even then, not every bishop granted it. The formal exorcism ritual, Rituale Romanum in later centuries, was a structured series of prayers, commands and gestures meant to drive out an unclean spirit in the name of Christ. In earlier medieval periods, similar rites existed but were often localized, passed down through monastic instruction or diocesan precedent. Exorcisms typically began with confession and cleansing. The afflicted person was expected to confess any sins, whether real or suspected, to remove any spiritual foothold the demon might be exploiting. Holy water was sprinkled liberally on the individual, the room, and sometimes the entire household. Crucifixes were held aloft. Psalms were read aloud, especially those invoking divine protection, Psalm 91, "Thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night" was a favourite. In more serious cases, fasting might be required beforehand, both for the priest and the afflicted. But these formal rites were rare and not always accessible to common people. For most villagers, banishing a demon meant turning to a mixture of church-sanctioned tools and inherited folk practices. Salt, for example, was one of the most trusted materials in both traditions. Blessed by a priest, it became a weapon against evil. A line of salt might be laid across a threshold around a bed or across the windowsill to keep spirits from entering, or to keep them trapped until morning. Candles blessed on Candlemas were also powerful tools. They were lit during storms, illness, childbirth, or spiritual unrest. The flame was a symbol of Christ's presence and purity. If a demon was suspected to linger in a home, one of these candles might be carried from room to room, its light pushing back unseen forces. Prayer, too, was essential, but not always loud or public. Some prayers were whispered, half out of fear, half out of superstition, that naming the demon too boldly might give it more power. Hail Marys, Paternosters, and invocations of the saints were all common. Saint Michael the Archangel, known as a warrior against evil, was especially popular. His name appeared in charms, in handwritten notes tucked behind icons, and even in scratched markings above doorways. Homes might also be ritually cleansed. Priests, if willing, would walk the rooms, sprinkling holy water and reciting Latin verses. But in their absence, villagers improvised. They burned incense, especially frankincense or myrrh if they could afford it, or more commonly, bundles of local herbs like sage, juniper and rue. Doors were shut and smoke allowed to fill the space. Children were kept outside. Pets were sometimes tied far from the house, especially if they had been acting strangely. Animals, it was believed, could become vessels or targets themselves. Objects thought to carry evil, a doll, a piece of clothing, an unfamiliar token left near the home, might be burned, buried, or thrown into running water. These acts were done quickly and often in silence, out of a deep-seated fear that acknowledgement gave demons strength. But the work did not stop with ritual. The real goal was to make the home spiritually inhospitable to evil. That meant regular prayers, clean living, confession, and proper observance of feast days. Families who had faced what they believed was a demonic presence often became more devout, more careful. They avoided certain words, kept to curfews, and paid closer attention to omens. Because in the medieval world a demon was not just a theological concept. It was a threat with weight, breath, and intention. It could linger in the rafters, sit at the foot of the bed, or whisper into dreams. And once it had come, it would not leave on its own. For those who believed they had been visited by something dark, something not of this world, the memories often lingered long after the rites were finished and the candles burned out. These were not vague impressions or passing dreams. They were described in vivid physical terms: the feeling of fingers brushing the skin, pressure at the base of the neck, the cold weight of a hand resting where no one stood. These visitations were spoken of quietly, often in private, and almost always with hesitation. But they were remembered in detail, because for those who experienced them, they felt real. First-hand accounts of such encounters appear in letters, confession records, and even court testimonies across medieval Europe. In one case, recorded in a 14th century parish document, a farmer's wife in Norfolk claimed to have felt the touch of a hand like ash pressing her awake in the middle of the night. She told her priest that her husband had been away and no one else was in the home. The pressure was so strong, she said, that she could not rise from bed until she whispered a prayer to St. Margaret, after which the touch withdrew and the room seemed to grow warmer. In another account preserved in a manorial record from Bavaria, a servant girl spoke of an encounter while staying in an old loft above the stables. She described being woken by a sudden chill, though it was midsummer, and feeling what she believed were hands lifting the edge of her blanket. When she tried to call out, she found she could not speak. The next morning, she said, there were marks, 3 faint bruises on her thigh, and the blanket folded neatly at her feet. The steward dismissed her story. The local priest noted it in the margins of the parish registry, adding only, "prayers advised." These were not isolated beliefs. Among ordinary people, Especially in rural communities, stories of unseen touches were widely known and cautiously shared. They were not always linked to demons, but sometimes to the dead. A restless soul, it was believed, might return to deliver a message, ask for prayer, or in darker tales, to punish those who had wronged them. A cold touch was the signature of something no longer living, a hand that left no mark, no sound, and no heat, only the memory of its presence. Families often had their own stories. A grandmother might recall her sister waking screaming after a shadow pulled her braid. A boy might whisper that his brother's cradle rocked on its own the night before he fell ill. These stories were shared in hushed tones, usually by firelight, and often with the warning, "Don't speak of it too much or it might come back." The church responded cautiously to such claims. While it acknowledged the possibility of visions and spiritual attacks, it also warned against attributing too much power to personal experience. Not every cold breeze was a demon. Not every unsettling dream meant a haunting. Still, priests were trained to listen, to bless the house if needed, and to encourage confession. Sin, after all, was believed to create openings, spiritual cracks through which evil could slip. Folk practice, however, was less reserved. Charms were carried or sewn into clothing, not for beauty, but for protection. Rowan wood, iron pins, and animal bones were all used as wards. Mothers taught children never to answer if they heard their names called at night. To do so, it was said, might invite something in. And if someone felt the cold touch again, especially more than once, they were told to recite prayers, never sleep alone, and cleanse the room with smoke or salt. For many, these measures worked. Or perhaps the touches simply stopped. Either way, the memory remained, and it was never fully forgotten. Because while many lived their entire lives without seeing a ghost or meeting a demon, nearly everyone knew someone who had felt something. A brush on the cheek, a pull at the blanket, a hand on the shoulder when no one stood behind them. These were not grand hauntings or loud possessions. They were quiet, intimate, personal, and that made them all the more difficult to forget. Some encounters were invisible but physical. Others left no touch at all, only signs. A curtain moved when no wind blew. A shroud slipped from the wash line. In many villages, these small domestic disturbances were not dismissed as accidents. They were read as warnings. In particular, the act of a burial shroud falling, slipping or tangling during laundering was deeply feared. It was not merely an inconvenience. It was a signal someone was going to die, perhaps soon, perhaps unexpectedly. Shrouds in the medieval period were simple but significant. Most were made of plain linen, unadorned and undyed, woven by hand, and often sewn within the household itself. For those who could afford it, a burial shroud might be kept ready for years in a chest or hanging in storage, prepared in advance like a candle for death's visit. When death came, the body would be washed, wrapped, and buried in this cloth, sometimes with a few holy words or herbs tucked into the folds. It was women, wives, mothers, daughters, who handled the laundering of linens, including shrouds, and they did so with great care. The belief that a shroud should never fall to the ground during washing or drying was widespread. If it did, especially on a clear day or with no strong wind, the meaning was ominous. Someone close to the household, or the one whose shroud had slipped, would not live long. A dropped shroud was said to call the grave early, inviting death before its rightful time. Superstitions grew around the practice. Some families washed shrouds only at dawn, never in the afternoon. Others never wrung them by hand, but let them drip dry, fearing that twisting the cloth might twist the fate of the person it was meant for. If a shroud tangled on the line or blew into a tree, it was treated almost like a curse, untangled with whispered prayers or, in some cases, burned and remade entirely. These beliefs were not confined to peasants. Even in wealthier homes, servants spoke in hushed tones about such incidents. In one recorded case from a 13th century estate in Normandy, a laundress reported that the shroud intended for the lady of the house fell from the hedge where it had been hung to dry. The woman was in good health at the time, but within a month she had died of a sudden illness. The laundress, dismissed in fear, was said to have muttered that the linen had known. Because so many deaths in the medieval world were sudden and unexplained, plague, fever, childbirth, accident, the idea that the world might give warning became a form of emotional structure. Laundry was not simply a chore, it was an act with spiritual implications. Clothes held the imprint of the body, shrouds held the memory of death, and to mishandle either was to risk interfering with fate. In some households, precautions were formalised. Pins might be placed at the corners of the shroud to keep it secure. A sprig of rosemary or yarrow might be laid across it as it dried, herbs associated with preservation and protection. If a shroud fell and touched the earth, it might be reblessed by a priest before use, or not used at all. There were stories, too, of shrouds behaving oddly just before a death. One would not dry no matter how many times it was washed. Another would not stay folded, slipping from a shelf without cause. Such tales circulated quietly, passed from mother to daughter, laundress to apprentice. They served not only as folklore but as caution. Be careful with the dead's clothing, be respectful of what is to come. Not all shrouds brought fear. A well-kept one, resting undisturbed for years, might even offer comfort, a sign that death was not yet near. But once it moved without reason, once it fell without wind, it changed. It became a message. In a time when few things could be predicted or controlled, the fall of a shroud stood out. It was a domestic omen, quiet but sharp. A reminder that death, like laundry, belonged to the women of the house, but unlike a tunic or a blanket, this cloth was never meant to return to the chest once washed. And if it did not behave as it should, the house took notice. Just as a shroud slipping from the line could signal that death had drawn near, so too could the unexpected stillness of time itself. In many homes, particularly among the modestly prosperous where timepieces were kept, there were whispered stories of clocks that stopped precisely at midnight, coinciding with or heralding a final breath. These accounts were not confined to folklore. They found their way into parish records, family journals, and oral traditions, all pointing to the same unsettling idea. When the clock ceased, so did the life it quietly marked. Mechanical clocks in the medieval world were rare and precious, usually found in monasteries, cathedral towers, or, by the later Middle Ages, in the homes of wealthy merchants and officials. These were not the household wall clocks of later centuries, but heavy, iron-bound mechanisms, sometimes tabletop devices, sometimes simple timekeepers with weights and bells. Their operation depended on regular winding and attentive care. Yet when one stopped without explanation, especially at the hour of midnight, it was rarely assumed to be mere mechanical failure. Midnight was not a neutral time in medieval thought. It was considered the deepest point of night, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. The devil's hour, often followed between midnight and 3, believed to be a time of heightened spiritual activity, temptation, and death. So when a clock's hands halted at that precise moment, it was taken not as coincidence, but as confirmation that something had passed, namely a soul. A story recorded by a French notary in the late 15th century tells of a minor nobleman whose clock stopped at midnight, the same hour he was found dead in bed by his servant. The gears were later examined and found to be in perfect condition. No weight had slipped, no cord had snapped, it had simply stopped. The family interpreted it as a divine sign that his time literally had come. The clock was never restarted. It remained on the mantle, frozen at the hour of his death. Even in homes without mechanical clocks, the tolling of bells played a similar symbolic role. Monastic bells were designed to measure time through the canonical hours, but their chimes were often heard and interpreted far beyond the monastery walls. If a bell rang at midnight without a monk pulling the rope, or if a bell rope was later found swinging on its own, locals might see it as the mark of a soul leaving the world. The time of night gave these incidents weight. The closer to midnight, the more ominous. Clocks that stopped at other times might also be noted, especially if the time matched the hour of death. But midnight held a special place in collective fear. It was the end of one day and the beginning of another. A transition, a crossing. To die at midnight, or to have something in the house acknowledge that death at that hour, meant the passing was not entirely unseen. The moment had been witnessed, even if only by the mechanism of time itself. Some families responded to such occurrences with reverence. The clock would be left as it was, never wound again. Others feared the object might retain some connection to the event. They buried it, sold it, or covered it with cloth. In certain cases, especially if the clock stopped multiple times under strange circumstances, it was believed to be cursed or inhabited by a spirit. A priest might be asked to bless it or to destroy it altogether. Whether the clock was mechanical or imagined, what mattered was the meaning. In a world where death came often and without warning, any sign that it had arrived, especially a sign as exacting as the halting of time, was remembered. Grandchildren were told the stories, visitors were shown the still clock. The object became part of the family's memory, a symbol of the moment life left and silence entered. Because in the medieval mind, time did not belong solely to man. It was governed by God, marked by bells, watched by angels, and on occasion, interrupted by death itself. And when the clock stopped at midnight, it was not a defect of gears, it was a message. And sometimes that message was not seen at all, but heard. In villages where silence after sunset was the norm, any sound out of place could carry meaning, none more so than footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human, approaching where no one should be. Stories of hearing footsteps without feet were common in medieval Europe, often recounted not with theatrical horror, but with quiet certainty. The sound of death arriving, they believed, was often audible before its consequences became visible. These accounts did not describe ghostly wailing or violent noise. Rather, they focused on the soft, ordinary sound of approaching feet, a creaking floorboard, gravel disturbed, wooden stairs groaning under a phantom weight. What made these footsteps chilling was not their volume, but their clarity, and the fact that no figure ever followed. In English rural tradition, it was said that when death came for someone, it might first pass through the village like a quiet traveller. One woman recalled hearing footsteps walk the path to her door 3 nights in a row. On the 3rd night, her eldest son, then serving abroad, was reported dead. In Germany, similar tales circulated, that footsteps heard outside a home, especially if they stopped at the threshold and never knocked, meant someone inside would not live long. If the sound circled the house before fading, the death would be slow. If it walked directly to the door and vanished, it would be sudden. Footsteps were especially feared when they occurred at night and were heard by multiple people. In small cottages where entire families slept in the same room, all would lie awake, staring into the dark, listening as the sound approached. Sometimes it paused at the wall, sometimes at the window, sometimes, more rarely, it moved across the floor inside, even when all the doors were barred. Church authorities tended to dismiss such reports as superstition, encouraging people to trust in confession and prayer rather than signs and sounds. But even priests, when confronted with multiple testimonies, might bless the threshold, sprinkle holy water near the hearth, or urge the family to say a rosary. In more isolated regions where the church's reach was thin, these sounds were treated with deadly seriousness. A family who heard them might burn a candle until morning, draw a line of salt across the doorway, or leave the door ajar to let death pass without taking. There were efforts to explain these occurrences naturally, the house shifting with the cold, livestock moving outside, a neighbour walking home late. But these explanations often failed under scrutiny, especially when the sound followed a known pattern, like familiar footsteps coming down a hallway, or boots crunching in snow with no trail left behind. In Wales and parts of Ireland, the phenomenon was sometimes referred to as the fetch or the forerunner, a spectral warning, often in the form of sound, that preceded death. While visual sightings of one's own fetch were said to predict personal demise, the sound of it, footsteps and breathing just out of sight, might come instead for those nearby. Families who had heard these sounds often waited with grim patience. They did not ask if someone would die, only who and when, and it was not always the oldest or the sickest. One of the most unsettling aspects of these tales was their unpredictability. A child might fall ill the next morning. A traveller might be found dead days later, far from home. Sometimes the connection was delayed but never forgotten. The sound had been real, and it had come for someone. In homes where footsteps had been heard, people became watchful. Curtains were drawn tighter. Lamps were kept burning longer. Conversations turned hushed. And when the inevitable happened, a death days or weeks later, the family did not feel surprised. They felt confirmed. These footsteps, then, became part of the broader medieval framework of death's signs, not dramatic, not visible, but sensed. Heard in the quiet hours, traced across the floor of a cottage or the stones of a chapel courtyard, vanishing just before dawn. They were not ghosts. Not yet. They were the arrival of death itself, quiet, courteous, and unrelenting. Because in a world where few people died peacefully and fewer died expectedly, the sound of footsteps in the night was not merely eerie. It was a knock without a knock, a call without a voice, a warning that the end had already begun. And sometimes that warning didn't come from a figure outside the door or a footstep on the path. Sometimes it came from within the very walls of the home. A knock where no one stood, a tapping that seemed to echo from inside the beams. These were not noises to be shrugged off. In the medieval world, houses were more than shelters. They were spiritual spaces. When a home knocked from within, it was believed to be speaking, and what it said was rarely good. These sounds were not confused with rats or wind or shifting wood, not by those who heard them. They described it differently, a rhythm too deliberate, too strong, too human to be dismissed. It might be 3 short knocks from the pantry, a single thud from behind the hearth, or a tapping from a wall that had stood quiet for decades. Most chilling of all were knocks that came in groups of 3, said to mock the Holy Trinity and signal the presence of something malevolent. Families who experienced these sounds often tried to locate the source. They'd search the house, press ears to the plaster, lift floorboards, or examine the chimney. But nothing would be found. And the knocking, inevitably, would return, sometimes only once more, sometimes for several nights, sometimes until someone in the home grew sick or died. Accounts of such events appear scattered across local records and private letters. A wool merchant in York wrote of 3 clear knocks coming from his kitchen wall the week before his infant daughter passed. A widow in rural Burgundy reported hearing knocking each night from the boards behind her bed after burying her husband, only for it to stop abruptly on the night she herself fell ill. These reports were not made with flair. They were simple, factual, and unnervingly consistent. In Catholic households, the first response was often spiritual. Holy water was sprinkled across thresholds and corners. A candle might be placed at the hearth or in the window, burned down to its base, while prayers were whispered into the silence. The Pater Noster, Ave Maria, and Psalm 91 were among the most common protections. Some families hung blessed items, crosses, saints' medals, or palm branches, near the spot where the sound had been heard. If the knocking persisted, the family might consult a priest. But ecclesiastical authorities were divided on the matter. Some dismissed the phenomena outright. Others acknowledged that souls in purgatory were believed to reach out, especially when masses had been neglected or when family members failed to honour the dead. In these interpretations, the knocking was not the devil's hand, but the grief of the departed seeking prayer or peace. Still, the fear remained. In folklore, homes that knocked were said to be marked. It was rarely assumed that the house was haunted in the modern sense. Instead, it was thought to be warning its occupants that death had entered its walls or would soon. Some said the house had memory, that wood and stone could absorb sorrow, that beams cut from trees grown near burial grounds or battlefields carried restless energy into the home. In parts of Ireland and Wales, knocking from within was sometimes attributed to the banshee, though her cries were more often described as wailing or keening. Still, when knocks came without cause, and someone died soon after, the connection was drawn. The house had heard her coming, or it had spoken in her place. When the noise stopped, it rarely brought comfort. In fact, many noted that silence after knocking was worse. It meant the message had been delivered. Nothing more needed to be said. In time, the story might be passed down. That was the wall your great-uncle heard knocking, a grandmother might say, and the next day he was gone. The beam became more than wood. It was a marker, the knock, more than sound. It was a memory, a warning that had once come too late. Because in a world where death crept quietly and grief left little trace, even the house itself was allowed to speak. And when it did, people listened, because they understood that silence too could speak, especially when something had been left unfinished. In the medieval world, death did not guarantee rest. The soul, it was believed, needed more than a final breath to pass peacefully, needed the right rituals, the proper prayers, and a body laid to rest in sacred ground. When those conditions weren't met, when burial was hurried, incomplete, or tainted by sin, the dead might return. They were not imagined as dramatic apparitions or storybook ghosts. More often they came subtly, in dreams, in whispers, in cold draughts that stirred no window. But when those signs were ignored, the visits could escalate. The restless dead might knock, wail, or even appear, silent, pale, and heavy-eyed, standing at the end of a bed or outside a threshold, always looking, never speaking, because the problem was not that they had died. The problem was that something had gone wrong afterward. In medieval Christian doctrine, burial was both a spiritual act and a communal responsibility. The body was to be washed, wrapped in a shroud, and laid in consecrated soil, usually the churchyard, surrounded by prayers and blessings. The soul was commended to God. Masses were expected, candles lit, names spoken aloud in church. When these rites were denied or cut short, the soul might linger. Improper burials could happen for many reasons. Sudden deaths in the field, unclaimed bodies, plague victims buried outside town boundaries, or suicides and unrepentant sinners denied church burial, all were considered spiritually vulnerable. Even accidents could have consequences. A grave dug too shallow, a name forgotten during the funeral rite, a shroud not tied correctly. Each could open a door. There are numerous records of villagers believing that the dead had returned due to burial errors. In a 13th century English parish, it was reported that a woman appeared nightly in the dreams of her former maid, asking why her grave had been dug beside a cursed tree. Only after the family had the body reburied elsewhere did the dreams cease. In Hungary, a man was exhumed and reinterred after livestock kept dying near his grave. His burial had been rushed without a priest due to a storm. Once corrected, the disturbances reportedly stopped. Priests took these concerns seriously, especially when the unrest seemed tied to neglect, not witchcraft. Masses could be offered retroactively. Bones might be moved to more proper ground. Clergy would occasionally visit the site and read prayers aloud, asking that the soul find rest and that the earth no longer be disturbed. Among the laity, the fear of the returning dead became part of daily caution. Shrouds were tied carefully. Graves were marked. Family members watched closely for signs in the days after a funeral. Strange dreams, animals behaving oddly, sudden illness. In some communities, a candle was left burning beside the door for 9 nights, a kind of spiritual vigil to prevent the soul from growing lost on its way to judgment. But not all stories involved peaceful resolution. In darker accounts, the dead returned visibly, walking with stiff limbs, decaying features, or open mouths. These were not ghostly wisps, but solid forms, revenants, as some chroniclers called them. Their presence was taken as a sign that something in life had been left unresolved, a murder unavenged, a debt unpaid, or a sin unconfessed. In these cases, no blessing or mass could correct the unrest until the truth was revealed. And yet, not all returning dead were feared. Sometimes they came to protect, a mother watching over her children, a father guiding his widow to a hidden coin. These too were believed. But the line between comfort and warning was thin, and few wished for the dead to linger, even with good intentions. To appear was to suggest unrest. What the medieval world feared most was not death itself, it was improper death. Death handled without dignity, death unattended by ritual. Because in their eyes, such a passing was incomplete. And what was incomplete might not stay buried, so they buried their dead with care. They prayed, they watched, and when the boards creaked in the middle of the night, they did not always assume it was the wind. Sometimes they wondered if someone had come home. But not all who disturbed the dead did so by accident or out of love. Some did it deliberately, for profit, for curiosity, or for darker reasons. And in doing so, they invited more than legal punishment. In the medieval mind, grave robbing was not just a crime. It was a spiritual violation, a disruption of sacred order that could bring ruin to both the thief and the community. The church considered the grave a place of rest, sanctified by ritual and blessed ground. It was not simply where the body was laid, it was where the soul's journey continued. To interfere with that space was to risk interrupting the passage between worlds, and that interruption carried consequences. Superstitions surrounding grave robbing were widespread and deeply rooted. One belief held that removing even a handful of earth from a grave could bring illness or madness. Others warned that stealing from the dead rings, rosaries, shoes would result in the object being cursed. The item might bring misfortune to its new owner, refuse to stay where it was placed, or even return on its own dirty and cold, as if rejecting the theft. Among common people, the fear of grave disturbance was compounded by a belief in spiritual retaliation. The dead, it was said, could feel the insult. A body unwrapped or dragged from its resting place might stir, not in body, but in spirit. The soul, drawn back in confusion or anger, might haunt the violator, or worse, follow them home. In one recorded case from 14th century Saxony, a farmhand was rumoured to have removed a copper brooch from a fresh grave to sell at market. Within days, he reportedly grew feverish and muttered in his sleep. By the week's end, he had died. The villagers blamed the stolen clasp. The brooch was returned to the churchyard and buried again, this time in a separate, unmarked patch of earth. Even touching a disturbed grave was considered risky. If someone tripped near one or stepped inside a partially collapsed plot, they were advised to make the sign of the cross immediately and offer a prayer for the dead. In some regions, they were also told to wash their hands in running water before returning home, lest they bring misfortune with them. Not all grave robbing was driven by greed. Medical study, limited and controversial in the medieval period, occasionally relied on stolen corpses, but even those who did so under the guise of scholarship were often met with suspicion and fear. The dissection of human bodies was considered deeply taboo for much of the Middle Ages, and those who practiced it were sometimes accused of necromancy, regardless of their intent. More feared still were those who disturbed graves for magic. In parts of Europe, it was believed that certain spells or charms required items from the dead, a bone, a tooth, or earth from beneath the body. These were whispered of in the same breath as curses and sickness. A wise woman found with such objects might be accused of witchcraft, even if her intent had been healing. Because once a grave was opened, no one could be sure what had been invited out. There were also protective measures taken to discourage grave robbing. In wealthier burials, especially those involving valuables, stone coffins or metal bands were sometimes used to seal the body. In some graveyards, thorny bushes were planted around plots to deter digging. And in more superstitious areas, graves were sprinkled with salt or iron filings to anchor the soul and protect the remains. But deterrence only went so far. When a grave was known or even rumoured to have been disturbed, the atmosphere in the village changed. Children were kept indoors at dusk. Masses might be said for the entire cemetery. In some cases, the disturbed grave was reconsecrated by a priest, with candles and prayer and soil blessed anew. Because the act of digging did more than unearth bones. It unravelled trust. It suggested that not even death could keep its boundaries. And for a community already surrounded by daily reminders of mortality, that was a terrifying thought. Because death wasn't always still. It wasn't always silent. Sometimes it showed itself in the flicker of a flame where no fire had been lit, in the darkness beyond the village path, or hovering low across churchyards. Travellers sometimes reported strange lights, faint, flickering, and just out of reach. These were not seen as tricks of the eye. They were known as corpse candles, a warning, a presence, or perhaps a guide from the other side. Across medieval Europe, belief in ghostly lights was widespread and persistent. The Welsh, who gave us the term canwyll corff, corpse candle, held especially rich traditions about these lights. It was said they could appear as pale blue or yellowish flames, often floating no higher than a man's knee, drifting along hedgerows, paths, or church lanes, usually on nights heavy with fog or rain. Unlike the comforting glow of a hearth, these lights did not warm, they did not crackle, and they never led anywhere a living person wanted to go. The most common belief held that corpse candles marked the route of a future funeral. The light was not just a presence, but a premonition. If seen moving toward a certain house, someone within that home was said to be marked for death. If it hovered at a crossroads or over water, it warned of a drowning. In some regions, two lights side by side foretold the deaths of both mother and child. These were not dramatic visions, just small flames glimpsed at the edge of the dark, but they were remembered. Witnesses often described the lights as moving with purpose. They did not dance like fireflies or waver like reflections. They floated forward slowly, steadily, following paths the living would walk in daylight, but doing so at night, and always alone. Those who claimed to follow them reported being led into marshes or thickets, only to have the light vanish. Some believed that if one followed too far, they might not return. The lights weren't meant to guide, they were meant to be seen and heeded. Church authorities offered varying responses to these reports. While some clergy dismissed corpse candles as superstitious nonsense, others, particularly in remote parishes, acknowledged the stories with caution. Priests might remind their flock that only God knows the time of death, but they stopped short of directly condemning those who claimed to have seen such lights. After all, many respected churchgoers, including monks and nuns, had privately recorded similar sightings. In one monastery chronicle, a prior noted seeing a pale flame pass through the cloister garden the night before a brother fell and died. Scientific explanations were, of course, unknown in the medieval period. Today we might call such phenomena ignis fatuus, the spontaneous combustion of gases over marshy ground. But to medieval villagers there was no natural cause. Fire belonged to the hearth, the forge, or the altar. If it appeared elsewhere untended and wandering, it meant something supernatural had broken through. Some tried to protect themselves against the danger of these lights. Carrying iron was a common defence, as was reciting a psalm or crossing oneself upon sighting a flame. In Wales, it was said that if you saw a corpse candle and did not speak of it, the death it warned of might be delayed. But if you named the house it approached, the fate was sealed. Silence, then, was not just wise, it was merciful. Children were warned not to chase strange lights. Travellers were told to avoid old burial roads at night. And if a corpse candle passed along a familiar lane, the neighbours watched that house in the coming days. A cough, a fainting, a sudden illness, anything could fulfil the prophecy. These lights became part of the landscape. People expected them, feared them, but they did not dismiss them. In a world with few certainties, the corpse candle offered a chilling one. That death was already moving, that it had chosen its path, and that it had sent a flame ahead to announce its coming. Because not all warnings were heard, some were seen, and some, like a quiet fire in the dark, were meant to burn only long enough to be believed. But when entire villages burned with fever and death came not as a visitor, but as an occupation, belief did not flicker, it surged. The great plagues of the medieval world, most notably the Black Death of the 14th century, left more than skeletal remains and shallow graves. They left stories, whispers, shadows that walked long after the bodies had been buried. In the decades that followed each outbreak, tales of the walking plague victims emerged, ghosts of the diseased, still roving through fields, alleys and chapel ruins, bearing the marks of a death too sudden, too monstrous to forget. The death tolls were staggering. In some towns, over half the population vanished in a matter of weeks. Mass graves were dug hastily, bodies stacked without rites or names. Priests died faster than they could bless. Bells rang until they cracked, and in the panic and collapse, ordinary burial customs were abandoned. This, to medieval minds, was more than a logistical failure. It was spiritual disorder on a catastrophic scale. With that disorder came the stories. In rural France, peasants spoke of seeing figures wrapped in burial cloths stumbling near plague pits, always at dusk, never speaking. In parts of Italy, entire neighbourhoods avoided certain paths after dark, claiming that figures cloaked in black could be seen walking in procession, as if retracing the route their bodies had once taken to the grave. In England, ghostly coughing was said to echo through the streets of abandoned hamlets years after the final victim had died. These were not distant, imagined fears. They were localised, specific. A farmer might tell you that the woman who had died without confession could be seen at the well on moonless nights. A shepherd might avoid a field, not because of wolves, but because the blue-eyed one still wandered it, clutching a rotted apron. Such figures were rarely malevolent. They did not chase or speak, but their presence was a reminder something had gone wrong with their deaths, and so their souls had not moved on. What made these stories particularly powerful was the shared memory of trauma. Everyone had lost someone. Everyone had seen the carts, the saws, the silence, and in the years that followed, When the fields grew quiet and the town slowly repopulated, the ghost stories helped explain the unease that remained. They gave shape to grief that had never been named, faces to prayers that had never been said. Church authorities were divided on how to respond. Some emphasised the need to consecrate former plague burial sites, blessing the land and holding mass for the unnamed dead. Others dismissed the tales outright, fearing that superstition would distract from proper theology. But neither approach could fully remove the fear. The wounds were too fresh, and for many it made sense that those who had died so quickly, so horribly, might not rest easily. Even decades later, places associated with plague deaths retained a reputation. Ruined chapels once used for last rites were said to echo with cries. Trees beneath which bodies had once been burned were avoided entirely. And any sudden illness that struck near these places was viewed with suspicion. Perhaps not a physical disease, but a spiritual one. The kind left behind by too much death too close together. Among lay people, protective practices evolved. People lit candles on the anniversaries of plague outbreaks. Holy water was sprinkled not only on homes but around the perimeter of entire villages. Some wore amulets said to protect against the dead who walk. Tiny bags of herbs, saints' relics, or iron tokens. In some areas, crosses were carved into trees near old plague pits, not to honour the dead, but to warn the living. Because even if the sickness was gone, its shadow was not. The ghost stories of plague victims did not arise from myth. They arose from memory, from the horror of watching death come faster than anyone could stop it, and from the guilt of knowing that the dead had been buried in haste, without names, prayers, or peace. In that vacuum, people began to see them again, on roads, in fields, at thresholds. They were not evil, they were reminders. And in the centuries that followed, their presence lingered, because death had not passed quietly, and some believed the dead never truly left. But not all signs came from the restless or the cursed. Some were believed to come from heaven itself, through sacred objects said to bleed, weep, or move on their own. These relics, bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, cloth said to have touched Christ, were already revered across medieval Christendom. But when they behaved strangely, when they shed tears or blood, or emitted fragrance or warmth, they were not just holy, they were messages. Whether miraculous or ominous depended on timing, context, and interpretation. In the medieval worldview, the line between the spiritual and the material was porous. Heaven and earth were connected through symbols and substances. Relics were physical connections to the divine, housed in churches, cathedrals, and monasteries, often displayed in reliquaries of gold and glass. They were kissed, prayed before, and carried in processions to ward off plague, drought, or invasion. But when such relics began to act, when a wooden cross dripped red or a statue shed tears, something was believed to be at stake. The Church approached these occurrences with caution. When reports emerged of a relic that bled or wept, bishops would sometimes dispatch investigators. Witnesses were questioned. The object was inspected for trickery. In some cases, fraud was uncovered. But not always. When no explanation could be found, and when the timing aligned with famine, war, or moral decline, many accepted the phenomenon as divine commentary. One of the most famous examples comes from a 13th century crucifix in northern Italy, said to have bled from the feet during Lent. The blood was collected on cloth and shown to the faithful, many of whom believed it was a warning to repent. Another account tells of a statue of the Virgin Mary in Bohemia that shed tears for 9 consecutive nights following a local massacre. Pilgrims flooded the town. Some came seeking comfort. Others feared judgment. These phenomena weren't always met with awe. Weeping relics could inspire fear just as easily as devotion. If the Virgin cried, what was she mourning? If a relic bled, was it suffering again or warning of what was to come? In a time when every harvest and every cough could tip the scales of survival, such signs were seen as direct commentary on the state of the world. In some cases, relics moved. Eyes that opened, heads that turned, hands that shifted position overnight. These claims were often made by monastic communities or local clergy, and though skeptics existed, the effect on the population was usually profound. People interpreted these signs as calls to prayer or to penitence. A relic that wept during a drought might be said to demand fasting or renewed tithes. A bleeding crucifix might signal the presence of sin in the village. In rare cases, it was even linked to coming death. While relics were considered instruments of divine grace, their strange behaviour could also carry more troubling associations. Some wondered if such signs were divine, but not from heaven. If a weeping statue inspired division, pilgrimage mania, or greed, was it truly holy? Or was the devil imitating the sacred to confuse the faithful? Church scholars debated this, especially as miraculous relics drew wealth and attention to certain regions. The fear of deception, spiritual and political, was never far behind. Lay people often bypassed these theological concerns. For them, the bleeding relic was real because they saw it, or because their grandmother had, or because the monk who told the story had no reason to lie. Whether or not the church declared it authentic, belief clung tightly to these events. People lit candles, offered coins, and made vows beside relics said to weep. They brought their sick, their blind, their infertile. Not because they understood how relics worked, but because something in that silent, dripping sign felt more certain than any sermon. In the end, these sacred manifestations became part of the same medieval tapestry as ghostly footsteps and corpse candles, different in tone, perhaps, but similar in effect. They reminded people that unseen forces were always watching, and sometimes speaking, through bone, through cloth, through carved wood, through tears and blood. Because heaven, too, had its ways of being heard. And not every miracle brought comfort, because even sacred things once animated could feel unsettling. Nowhere was this tension more deeply felt than in the case of religious icons. Painted images of Christ, the Virgin, or the saints that were said not only to move or weep, but to watch. These were not simply devotional objects hung on chapel walls or placed behind altars. They were believed at times to be aware. Icons held a central place in medieval worship. Though more common and elaborate in Eastern Christianity, they were present throughout Europe, especially in the form of painted panels and portable altarpieces. These images were not understood merely as symbols. They were windows, spiritual mirrors, or even vessels through which divine presence could be accessed. And so when an icon behaved in ways that suggested consciousness, eyes that followed, faces that changed, shadows that shifted, people paid attention. Stories of icons that watched were not rare. In monasteries, it was sometimes said that an icon of the Virgin turned her gaze during Compline, or fixed her eyes on a brother who had sinned. In churches, altar paintings were rumoured to glance toward parishioners who had confessed poorly, or who hadn't confessed at all. These movements were rarely dramatic. The image did not blink or speak, but its eyes, some claimed, would shift imperceptibly, watching those who passed with something deeper than paint. It was this perceived attention that unsettled many. A statue with eyes was expected to look. A relic did not look at all. But a flat panel, lifeless, unmoving, was not supposed to see. And yet, many believed it did. Pilgrims sometimes reported a sense of pressure or presence while kneeling before a revered image. Some turned away, convinced they were being judged. Others wept under its gaze, certain they were being seen, not just outwardly, but inwardly in the soul. In one 14th century English priory, a monk recorded that a painted Christ above the choir looked toward the novices each night during matins. He wrote that 2 young brothers had confessed to impure thoughts after believing the icon had turned its gaze to them in reproach. Whether the event occurred as described or not, the monk considered the confession a victory of the image's moral power. Such stories, though accepted in many quarters, could also provoke anxiety. If an icon could see, could it judge? And if it judged, could it condemn? Was it a source of grace or surveillance? For some, these concerns were theological. The Church warned against idolatry, the belief that the image itself was divine, rather than a representation of the divine. But enforcement of that distinction varied widely. To a poor villager, a painting that stared from the church wall was not just a painting. It was Christ himself watching, and that watchfulness came with weight. Children were told to behave in front of the holy images. Women crossed themselves when passing them. Men averted their gaze if they felt unclean. The fear was especially strong when the icon was damaged. If an image was cracked, faded, or defaced, its eyes might appear to shift unnaturally with the light. This could reinforce the sense that the image was alive, but pained. In one Bohemian village, a weather-worn crucifix with missing paint was said to cry blood from its remaining eye after lightning struck the chapel roof. Some believed it was a warning, others believed the damage had awakened something. Even silence around these icons was loaded. A priest who refused to answer whether the image could see might unintentionally invite more speculation. And if the icon became known for miracles, answered prayers, unexplained healings, its watchfulness grew more intense in the minds of the faithful. A shrine's reputation could rise or fall on such stories. People travelled long distances to kneel under those painted eyes, and some, just as quickly, fled them. Whether the icon truly moved was often less important than the shared certainty that it could. Its gaze became part of the space it occupied. Its presence shaped behaviour, inspired devotion, and enforced silence. And in a world where confession could mean salvation or shame, the idea that the image on the wall was watching made many think twice before lying to themselves. Because it did not need a mouth to speak. It only needed eyes that never closed. But not all sacred objects inspired reverence. Some, especially relics taken from their rightful resting places, inspired dread. While bones of saints were supposed to offer protection, healing and divine favour, stolen relics carried the opposite reputation. They were dangerous, unsettling, and in many cases believed to bring misfortune. In the medieval world, to take bones unlawfully, even with good intentions, was to invite consequences, because not all relics wanted to be moved. The veneration of relics was widespread and deeply embedded in medieval religious life. Churches competed to house the remains of saints, skulls, teeth, fingers, even entire skeletons, believing that a powerful relic would draw pilgrims, prestige, and divine favour. Pilgrimage routes were often defined by the relics they ended at. Communities protected their relics with locked reliquaries, elaborate shrines, and tightly controlled rituals. But as demand for relics grew, so did theft. Sometimes the thieves were rivals. Monks or abbots from competing churches eager to elevate their own institution. Other times, the thefts were motivated by desperation. Towns suffering from famine or plague believed that acquiring a saint's remains might turn their fortune. In still other cases, relics were looted during warfare, taken from burned monasteries or plundered cathedrals. Whatever the reason, stolen relics were not always welcomed by those who received them. It was widely believed that relics taken without the consent of the saint or of God would punish those who moved them. Accounts of bad harvests, illness, miscarriages and sudden death followed some of the most infamous relic thefts. In one 12th century case, a group of monks from Flanders reportedly stole the arm of a local martyr during a nighttime raid on a rival abbey. Within a month, 2 of the thieves had died under mysterious circumstances. The others suffered visions and returned the relic by foot, fasting all the way. These stories were not fringe superstitions. Chroniclers, abbots, and even bishops wrote about them. The common thread was always the same. The saint had been disturbed. The remains had not been honoured. And the bones, though silent, had not forgiven. Even relics acquired through more formal channels could bring unease. If the remains were mishandled, dropped, exposed to weather, or placed in a poorly maintained shrine, it was said the saint might withdraw their blessing or show displeasure. A cracked reliquary or a tarnished container could signal spiritual neglect. Some monks recorded sudden droughts or unexplained illness in their communities, attributing them to forgotten obligations to their local relics. There were also fears surrounding false relics, with so many bones circulating across Europe and so much faith invested in their authenticity, it was inevitable that fakes would appear. Traders sometimes sold bones of animals or unknown persons, claiming them to be from saints. When bad luck followed the arrival of a new relic, it was sometimes taken as proof that it was not only false, but cursed. In more superstitious regions, people whispered that not all relics were saintly, that some bones venerated as holy might in fact belong to sinners or unquiet dead. A relic that brought nightmares, inexplicable illnesses, or visions was treated with extreme caution. Some churches buried such items discreetly, others sealed them in stone boxes and hid them within walls, never to be displayed again. These fears were not limited to the clergy. Among lay people, stories circulated of relics that refused to stay put, bones that rolled out of reliquaries, caskets that could not be nailed shut, shrines that drew lightning during storms. Some people avoided walking near them after dark. Others refused to enter certain chapels entirely. To mishandle the sacred was to court disaster. Yet, despite all this fear, relics remained powerful. People continued to venerate them, to travel hundreds of miles to touch their containers, to weep before their altars. The belief in their power, whether to heal or to punish, was never in question. What mattered was how they were treated, whether the saint approved, whether the bones wanted to be there. Because in the medieval imagination, the dead were not silent, and their remains, once declared holy, were not inert. They watched, they remembered when taken without respect, they responded. And sometimes the first sign was not thunder or plague. It was a whisper of bad luck that would not go away. And sometimes that whisper wasn't a sickness or a dream, but something far more visible, something placed or fallen or turned. Among the clearest and most unsettling of these signs was the inverted cross. In churches, homes, or shrines, the sight of a cross turned upside down was never taken lightly. It was rarely assumed to be a simple accident. In the medieval imagination, a reversed cross, especially one that had not been intentionally placed that way, was a warning, a sign that something sacred had been disturbed, or worse, that something unholy had entered. The Christian cross was more than a symbol of faith. It was a boundary marker between sacred and profane, light and darkness, protection and vulnerability. Crosses were everywhere, carved above doors, etched into walls, embroidered on clothing, engraved into coins. They marked graves, altars, and battlefield standards. And in all these places they were supposed to point upward. The long beam anchoring heaven to earth, the shorter beam representing human suffering, held in balance. When that balance was reversed, when the long beam faced downward, it became a symbol of disorder. In some cases, an upside-down cross was not a mistake at all. St. Peter, according to tradition, was crucified on an inverted cross, deeming himself unworthy to die in the same manner as Christ. For this reason, the symbol was not inherently blasphemous, but in common medieval culture, the nuance was lost. An inverted cross, especially outside of hagiographic art, was almost universally associated with spiritual threat. Reports of crosses found upside down appear in monastery chronicles, parish registers, and even trial records. In one English village in the early 14th century, a wooden cross that hung above the church porch was discovered reversed after a night of violent winds. The villagers replaced it, but when it was found upside down again the next morning, with no sign of a storm or tampering, panic spread. A series of misfortunes followed. The baker's child fell ill, a fire damaged the wool storehouse, and one man reportedly saw a black shape crouched near the lych gate at dusk. Whether connected or not, the cross was eventually removed and replaced with a stone carving, blessed 3 times. In homes, crosses were often hung above beds or thresholds as protection. If one fell, especially if it landed face down or upside down, it was immediately set upright and the area sprinkled with holy water. It was said that demons or restless spirits could not bear the sight of the cross and might attempt to overturn or dislodge it. When this occurred more than once, families might call for a priest to bless the house or conduct minor rites of exorcism. In more isolated areas, the local wise woman or healer might be summoned to place protective herbs, rowan, vervain, or St. John's wort at the corners of the room. The fear was not always that a devil had entered, but that the cross itself was warning of something unseen. The sign of God had turned away, the blessing had reversed, and whatever came next might not be prevented. Priests, depending on their temperament and training, responded in different ways. Some took the events seriously, urging confession and penance from the household. Others dismissed it as superstition, warning that excessive fear could itself become a form of idolatry, treating the object as magical rather than sacred. But even these priests tended to perform some ritual cleansing, if only to ease the minds of the congregation. Symbolic inversion of crosses, icons, or sacred texts was also linked to accusations of witchcraft or heresy. In some trials, defendants were accused not merely of cursing or poisoning, but of deliberately turning crosses upside down as part of their rites. These actions were seen not only as defiant, but as invitations to spirits, demons, or death itself. Whether the accused had actually done so was often irrelevant. The power of the symbol and the fear it provoked was real enough to shape reputations and fates. What made the inverted cross so unsettling was its simplicity. It did not require words, wounds, or fire. It only needed gravity, a breeze, or a quiet hand. And yet the message it carried was heavy. Something was wrong. Something sacred had shifted. And in a world where signs were sought in every cough, every cracked beam, and every shivering candle flame, a turned cross was among the clearest. Because once it pointed downward, the question was never whether it had fallen. It was why. Why had the cross turned? Why had the blessing reversed? And what unseen force had passed through unnoticed until the sign revealed its presence? In the medieval world, not all dangers came with footsteps or shadow. Some, it was believed, came silently through a look. The evil eye, a glance rooted in envy or malice, was feared across Europe as a form of spiritual assault. It needed no incantation, no touch, no object. Just a stare, a glance, often from someone known, that could cause crops to fail, milk to sour, animals to sicken, or even a child to die. This belief was not confined to folk tales or fringe communities. Across medieval Christendom, from Sicily to the British Isles, warnings about the evil eye appeared in sermons, medical texts, and household instructions. The gaze of the envious was said to carry weight, and when cast upon the vulnerable, especially infants, brides, or livestock, it could bring illness or ruin without leaving a mark. The idea was simple, and that made it powerful. A person filled with resentment or unspoken jealousy could project that negative energy, consciously or not, through their eyes. This belief predated Christianity, rooted in ancient Greek and Roman traditions, but in the medieval period it was absorbed into daily life. Monks warned against pride and envy. Physicians cautioned mothers to keep their babies out of sight for the first weeks. Farmers avoided boasting about a successful yield if the wrong neighbour was nearby. Not every look was dangerous, but when something went wrong, and especially when it went wrong suddenly, the question often followed: who was watching? If a healthy child took sick the day after a visit from a neighbour who had suffered loss, the connection was drawn. If a man bragged of his new horse and found it lame the next morning, he might remember a passerby's lingering stare. Protection against the evil eye was as varied as the fear itself. Amulets were common, small charms shaped like hands, eyes, or crosses. In Catholic regions, medals of saints, especially Saint Benedict, were worn or hung above cradles and stalls. Garlic, salt, and iron were also used. Mothers might spit lightly near their children after receiving a compliment, a symbolic act meant to break the power of the gaze. Some families avoided praise altogether, fearing that to say too much good was to tempt both fate and envy. In Spain and parts of southern Italy, the mal de ojo was considered so serious that specific rituals were used to detect and cure it. A drop of oil in water, for example, was believed to spread unnaturally if the evil eye was present. In some cases, the afflicted would be passed through smoke or washed in herbal infusions, while prayers were spoken and protective signs made over the body. The Church took a complex stance. Official doctrine discouraged belief in magical thinking, but priests and monks were often familiar with the customs and fears of their communities. In sermons, envy was condemned not just as sin, but as poison to others. The evil eye became, in effect, a moral warning, not merely a supernatural threat, but a reflection of spiritual sickness. Some theologians wrote that envy itself was a form of murder, killing not the body, perhaps, but joy, peace, and health. Those accused of casting the evil eye were not always witches or outsiders. Often they were ordinary people, old women, childless couples, widowers, those whom life had treated harshly and whose misfortunes made others nervous. Their presence at births, weddings, or harvests could cause discomfort, especially if followed by trouble. Accusation rarely needed proof. All it took was timing and suspicion. And yet belief in the evil eye persisted for one reason above all. It gave people a way to explain the inexplicable. Why had the child died? Why had the cow stopped giving milk? Why did a household suddenly grow cold and sullen after joy? If no cause could be seen, it was easier to believe the harm had been seen by someone else in silence. Because in a world where misfortune struck often and without warning, the evil eye gave shape to uncertainty. It was invisible but not undetectable. It had no voice, but many witnesses, and it reminded people that sometimes danger didn't need to knock or curse or even speak. It only needed to look. But when eyes weren't enough, words followed. In the narrow lanes of medieval markets, where bread was bartered, wool measured, and tempers ran thin, words were more than conversation. They were weapons. And in some cases, they were curses, not the kind uttered in formal ritual or muttered over boiling pots, but the everyday sort, angry, muttered phrases, whispered threats, barbed gossip. In a world where language held real power, even an insult could be understood as a hex. The medieval marketplace was not just an economic hub. It was a social stage, a space where tension simmered just beneath the surface. Women selling milk, men hawking iron nails, children running between stalls. Everyone heard everything. A sharp tongue could ruin a reputation. A single phrase, said at the wrong moment, could linger longer than any coin exchanged. Not all curses were deliberate. Some were spontaneous outbursts. May your bread never rise. You'll pay for that in sickness, or that coin will rot in your purse. Others were cloaked in civility, delivered with a smile. Strange, your sheep don't look so healthy these days. Or, it's a shame how many pests a garden like yours can draw. In villages where bad luck was watched carefully and coincidences were rarely trusted, these words were remembered, especially if misfortune followed. There are records of formal complaints being made against market women or wandering peddlers accused of ill-speaking. In one 14th century case from northern France, a woman was summoned to explain herself after muttering something under her breath as she left a fish stall. The seller's husband fell ill the next day. Whether the two events were related didn't matter. The connection had been made in the minds of those who heard her. She was ordered to confess and pay penance. It wasn't just about what was said, but who said it. Certain people were more likely to be suspected: older women, healers, foreigners, the poor. A woman who had suffered losses, who spoke rarely, or who had once been accused of anything unnatural was particularly vulnerable. If she argued in the market, especially if she lost her temper, and trouble followed, her words could be remembered as a curse rather than a complaint. Gossip itself became a kind of indirect spellcasting. Her husband's lame now, did you hear? She touched that batch of eggs and none of them hatched. These were not formal accusations, but they planted seeds. They shaped how others looked at a person. Over time, these whispered connections between words and outcomes built reputations that were difficult to shake. Some people actively worked to protect themselves against verbal curses. Coins were rubbed with salt. Aprons were pinned with hidden crosses. Certain sellers sprinkled water from the church font around their stalls before setting up. Not all believed these acts would break a curse, but many felt they helped. And in a place where fear and fortune stood side by side, small rituals offered peace of mind. The church's response to spoken curses was uneven. Some clerics condemned such speech as sinful and warned of the devil's influence in idle talk. Others saw the danger, not in magic, but in malice, arguing that a wicked heart could do more harm through rumour than any charm. Public penance was occasionally demanded for those whose words were blamed for another's suffering, especially if confession failed to settle tensions. But the deepest fear lay not in whether a person had cursed another intentionally, but in the possibility that words alone could carry weight. That anger, once spoken, might find its mark. That the market was not just a place of trade, but a place of spiritual risk, where envy and insult mingled with grain and linen, where every phrase could linger longer than the echo of a bell. It was a fear grounded in daily life. No candles, no spells, just human voices, speaking carelessly or cruelly or with too much knowledge, and the quiet dread that followed. Because in the medieval mind, speech was not empty. It could bless, it could damn, and in the space between it could curse. Nowhere was that fear more visceral than in the food one ate. Bread, pies, stews and ale were not just staples of survival, they were potential instruments of harm. In the medieval world, food was not always trusted, even when it came from a familiar hand. Particularly in times of tension, famine or sickness, people watched closely what was offered and who had prepared it. Because while the idea of poison was real, there was a second fear, quieter but deeper: cursed food. Not tainted with toxins, but with intent. Bread, The daily sustenance of nearly every household held particular importance. It was both physical nourishment and spiritual symbol. Christ himself was described as the bread of life. Loaves were blessed at Easter, broken at weddings, and offered to the dying. But this sacred association made bread especially vulnerable in the eyes of a suspicious community. If someone fell ill after a shared meal or a loaf turned mouldy overnight without cause, questions were asked. Had it been handled by someone envious, someone who muttered while kneading, someone who lingered too long at the oven? Stories circulated in villages and towns about bread that brought nightmares, or sudden vomiting, or misfortune that lingered long after the meal. In many such stories, it was not poison that was blamed, it was a curse, something spoken over the flour or added with a pinch of ash or herb before baking. The cook's intent, not the ingredients, was feared. Pies and pastries carried similar suspicion, especially when given as gifts. A meat pie left at a doorstep, a fruit tart brought by a neighbour after an argument. Such offerings were often accepted with caution or not at all. There are records of pies being left untouched on windowsills, then thrown into the fire the next morning to see if it would scream, according to a Yorkshire folk account. Burning cursed food, some believed, might expose its unnatural contents or at least nullify the spell. These anxieties were strongest during times of hardship, when crops failed or livestock died, when children grew thin or mothers miscarried. People looked for causes, and food, already bound to survival and social ritual, became suspect. A neighbour whose cheese never spoiled, a baker whose loaves were always perfect, might be watched more closely than praised. Skill could be interpreted as unnatural, cleanliness as manipulation, and if the baker was also a widow, or a healer, or had once been accused of ill-speaking, the connection became dangerous. Women were often at the centre of these suspicions. As primary food preparers, they bore the weight of both nourishment and risk. Midwives and wise women who distributed herbal remedies were especially vulnerable. A tisane meant to ease digestion might be blamed for a stomach cramp. A spice loaf brought to a new mother could be accused of souring her milk. The overlap between healing and harm was too narrow to be trusted without question. Clerical authorities addressed these concerns cautiously. While the Church condemned poisoning as murder and warned against superstitions, it also upheld the belief that words and intentions mattered. Blessings were said before meals. Bread could be sanctified, holy water sprinkled near the hearth. These rituals were not just expressions of gratitude, they were defences. The sacred could protect against the profane. Some communities developed their own protective customs. A piece of the loaf might be tossed into fire before eating. Bread might be marked with a cross before being sliced. In certain regions, families refused to eat food baked outside the home on holy days or during eclipses, when spiritual danger was believed to be stronger. In rare cases, accusations of food curses led to legal complaints, or worse, to formal charges of witchcraft. Whether poisoned or cursed, food carried more than flavour. It held intent. And in a world where harm could come silently through envy or malice, every shared meal was a moment of trust or of risk. Because in the medieval kitchen, the danger was not always in what went in the pot. It was in what followed after it was eaten. And sometimes it wasn't what one ate, said or did, but who one was that determined the course of misfortune. In the medieval world, few things were more quietly feared than the notion of a family curse. These were not always spoken aloud. Often they were only whispered about through generations, across neighbours' fences, between clergy behind closed doors. A lineage marked by ruin, a name that carried with it loss, madness, betrayal, or death. It didn't need proof. It only needed memory. Every village had its examples. A family whose sons never survived past 30. A noble line whose heirs always died in violent ways. A widow whose children were all lost in infancy, as her mothers had been. Perhaps it was a failed harvest year after year despite good soil. Or a house that, no matter how many times it changed hands, still seemed to bring sickness or sorrow to those who lived in it. These patterns were noticed, catalogued, and quietly discussed. And when no natural explanation could satisfy the question, why does it keep happening? The answer often was a curse. Family curses were rarely attributed to recent acts. They were almost always rooted in something long ago, an ancestor's crime, a sin gone unconfessed, a stolen inheritance, a child rejected, or a marriage violently prevented. The idea was that wrong had been done and not repented, and that the stain of it lingered not just in the soul of the sinner, but in the blood of their descendants. In legal records and clerical notes, we sometimes find indirect evidence of these beliefs. A priest advising a family to make a pilgrimage for reasons deep and generational. A monk noting that a certain house had never known peace. A village record describing an estate as dark in fortune since the third steward. These were not casual observations. They reflected a widespread belief that curses could be inherited. And while not every family believed itself cursed, those who did often behaved accordingly. Some avoided certain names when christening their children, believing those names had brought ill luck in past generations. Others clung fiercely to confession, fasting, or good works, hoping in silence to break a cycle they could not name. There were stories of families who sent their youngest sons to monasteries to escape the family fate, or who refused to marry off their daughters, believing childbirth would awaken the curse. In more dramatic cases, relics or heirlooms were believed to carry the curse itself. A ring never worn, a portrait kept turned to the wall, a ledger no one dared open. These objects were passed down like burdens, and though few spoke of them openly, they were handled with extreme care or hidden entirely. Neighbouring villagers played a role too. They noticed patterns, they made connections, and often they treated the family with a mix of pity and wariness. A woman from a cursed family might struggle to find a husband. A man might find his business quietly boycotted, despite being honest and hard-working. The curse, once named, had a life of its own. It followed, whispered, unseen but felt. The church, as with many folk fears, maintained a careful line. It condemned the idea that blood alone could carry spiritual guilt, reminding the faithful that each soul stood alone before God. Yet in practice, the clergy often responded to claims of family curses with rites, blessings, exorcisms, vigils and pilgrimages meant to cleanse the house or lift the burden. A priest might never say the word curse, but his actions suggested otherwise. Breaking a family curse, it was believed, required more than prayer. It required penance, restitution, and often suffering. Someone had to make amends for what was done generations before. And until that happened, the family would continue to live under its weight. Most such curses were never written down. They existed in silences, patterns and absences, in unspoken tragedies, in names missing from family trees, in rooms no one entered after dusk. Because in the medieval mind, some things could not be undone, only endured. And sometimes what could not be endured was the arrival of someone unfamiliar, someone whose face did not belong to any remembered name, whose voice carried no shared stories, and whose footsteps did not echo from any known path. In the closed world of the medieval village, where bloodlines were traced, surnames repeated, and alliances stretched back generations, strangers were rarely welcomed without hesitation. Outsiders brought disruption, questions, and, more dangerously, possibility. Possibility of illness, of theft, of sin, or of sorcery. To be unknown was, in many places, to be already suspect. Most villages in medieval Europe were small, insular, and deeply interconnected. Land was inherited, families intermarried, and even distant kinship created social bonds. The sudden appearance of a stranger, a travelling worker, a pilgrim, a merchant, or worse, someone who settled, upset the balance. People began to watch. Whispers followed. Why had they come? What were they hiding? Why now? Even travelling monks or friars, recognised as spiritual men, were sometimes met with caution. A robe did not always guarantee trust. Had they been sent from a known abbey? Did the parish priest vouch for them? Were their relics genuine? For ordinary strangers without such status, the scrutiny was harsher. Strangers who arrived during times of hardship were especially feared. During plague years or after a failed harvest, suspicion sharpened. If a new face appeared and sickness followed, the connection was made. Travellers from other regions were sometimes accused of spreading disease, even if they themselves fell ill. In France, there are records of towns turning away beggars and peddlers under threat of violence. In England, certain villages posted watchers at their borders to intercept anyone unfamiliar. Hospitality, once seen as a Christian duty, bent under the pressure of fear. Women, particularly those alone or unmarried, faced the harshest suspicion. A lone woman who settled at the edge of a village, perhaps claiming to be a healer or midwife, was often watched more closely than welcomed. If she kept to herself, she was hiding something. If she was too friendly, she was gathering secrets. And if misfortune followed her arrival, a miscarriage, a spoiled barrel, a poor lambing season, her name would be the first spoken when blame needed a direction. Even strangers who meant no harm could be drawn into conflict. A man who spoke with an unfamiliar accent might be blamed for a stolen sheep. A woman who wore foreign fabric might be accused of vanity or witchcraft. Children were told not to accept sweets or stories from people whose hands hadn't shaped the soil. Outsiders, even if honest, brought difference. And difference was dangerous. This suspicion wasn't only emotional, it had practical roots. In a world where communities had to rely on themselves for survival, trust was as important as bread. Land was limited, resources were counted. A new family meant more mouths, more competition, and possibly more risk. A stranger might bring news, but they might also bring legal trouble, disease, or spiritual contamination. The unknown was not romantic, it was unstable. Local traditions reinforced this wariness. In some places, newcomers had to undergo long periods of observation before being granted rights or land. Others required that a new resident be vouched for by multiple established families. Even then, acceptance could take years, sometimes never fully arriving. A stranger might live peacefully in a village for decades and still be referred to as the one who came from elsewhere. Church teachings encouraged hospitality and charity, but even these had limits. Priests might feed the hungry traveller, might give shelter for a night, but few offered open arms to those who stayed. Stories of saints and pilgrims travelling in disguise were shared to remind people of kindness. But they competed with stories of wolves in sheep's clothing, of witches in servants' garb, of demons who knocked with a friendly smile. And so the stranger remained a figure of tension, carrying the burden of stories never told and suspicions never fully spoken. They could find a place, earn respect, even marry into the village, but they were rarely forgotten as outsiders. Because in the medieval village, identity was not only who you were, it was who remembered you. And if no one remembered you, then the only thing people could trust was their fear. And few things were more quietly feared than knowledge that didn't fit, wisdom that went too far or came from the wrong place. In medieval Europe, to be intelligent was not inherently suspicious. Monks copied manuscripts, priests taught from the pulpit, and noblemen hired tutors for their sons. But when learning was found outside its expected place, when a layman quoted scripture too precisely, when a woman spoke of herbs in terms too technical, or when a traveller referenced books no one else had seen, people grew wary. Knowledge, in the wrong hands or spoken at the wrong time, could look like pride, or heresy, or witchcraft. The idea of the man who knew too much appears often in village folklore. He is rarely a villain outright, more often a figure of unease, a tenant who predicts storms without consulting the priest, a blacksmith who knows too much about metallurgy and not enough about saints, a man who speaks more Latin than his lord or owns more books than the local friar. These were men who stepped outside the invisible boundary between acceptable knowledge and dangerous wisdom. In a deeply hierarchical society, knowledge was meant to mirror status. Monks were literate because they were holy. Nobles learned law and history because they ruled. Physicians and scholars had licenses from church-approved institutions. But when someone acquired knowledge through unofficial means, when it wasn't taught in a monastery or sanctioned by a guild, it was treated with suspicion. How had they learned? Who had taught them? And what else did they know? Folklore tells of men who read too much and were later found muttering to themselves in the fields, of men who travelled to far cities and returned changed, full of strange ideas and new words. One tale from East Anglia spoke of a shepherd who learned to read and began drawing strange symbols in chalk. When a series of bad harvests followed, villagers accused him of bargaining with unclean spirits. Whether or not he had done anything unusual didn't matter. The knowledge itself had set him apart. Heresy and learning were uneasy bedfellows. Inquisitorial records from the 13th and 14th centuries show that some of the most troubling figures, in the eyes of church authorities, were not violent rebels, but thinkers. Lay preachers, amateur theologians, unlicensed healers, these were the ones who could sow doubt. A man quoting the Bible too confidently could be accused of spreading heretical interpretations. A local scribe with access to banned texts might be summoned for questioning. Even possessing a book written in the vernacular could arouse suspicion, especially if it dealt with religious matters. The fear was not just that these men knew too much, but that they knew it without permission. Villages operated on unspoken rules of trust. Everyone had their role. The shepherd tended sheep, the miller weighed grain, the priest managed souls. When a man stepped outside those bounds, by knowing, reading, or speaking beyond his station, he disrupted the order. And disruption in a world already fraught with plague, famine, and spiritual anxiety was dangerous. Some of these learned men were tolerated, especially if their knowledge was useful. An herbalist who knew how to treat wounds, a weather watcher who helped save a harvest, a man who knew the stars and could fix a broken plough, all these might earn a grudging respect. But if misfortune followed them, or if they spoke too freely, they might find that same knowledge turned against them. Books could be burned, houses avoided, eyes cast downward when they passed. Occasionally, these men were brought into the fold, pressed into service by a nobleman or asked to teach a priest's son. But many more remained on the edge. Not quite outcast, not quite accepted, just watched. Because it wasn't just what they knew, it was that they knew without asking. And in a world built on hierarchy and obedience, that kind of knowing could feel like defiance. And sometimes defiance was explained in far darker terms. In the minds of many medieval villagers, a man who refused the boundaries of proper behaviour, who walked alone at night, who muttered to himself, who vanished for days and returned with scratches or bloodied clothes, might not just be strange. He might be something else entirely. Shape-shifting, particularly the transformation of men into wolves, was a fear rooted deep in European folklore. While the term werewolf was not uniformly used across all regions, the concept of a human turning into a beast, especially under the influence of the devil, was widespread. These were not stories reserved for entertainment. They were explanations. When livestock was found torn apart, when children disappeared near the forest's edge, when a man behaved with unusual strength or violence, tales of shape-shifting often followed. Wolves, in particular, were powerful symbols. They prowled just beyond the safety of the village. They were predators of livestock, and in rare cases humans. But more than that, they were associated with chaos, wilderness, and the breakdown of Christian order. To live like a wolf, or to become one, was to reject civility and God's law. It was no coincidence that accusations of shape-shifting were often levelled at men already seen as suspicious: hermits, foreigners, recluses, or those who had survived misfortune too often. Some legal records, particularly in regions like France and the Holy Roman Empire, include confessions, many extracted under duress, of men who claimed to have turned into wolves under the devil's influence. These confessions typically involved pacts made at crossroads, ointments rubbed into the skin, or belts said to trigger the transformation. In these accounts, the man would take the shape of a beast, hunt by moonlight, and return at dawn with no memory, or, chillingly, full recollection of his deeds. Church authorities did not always accept these claims at face value. Many clerics saw them as evidence of demonic delusion rather than physical transformation. However, the broader population often took them literally. Folk belief didn't distinguish sharply between body and soul. If a man behaved like a beast, perhaps he was one, whether by choice, by curse, or by satanic arrangement. In Scandinavian and Slavic traditions, the concept of lycanthropy, not merely becoming a wolf but suffering as one, took on complex meanings. Some tales described it as punishment for sin. Others, particularly in Eastern Europe, spoke of wolf men as cursed protectors, forced into their form to guard something or someone, though rarely thanked for it. In Western Europe, however, the werewolf was almost universally seen as a threat. This fear filtered into daily life. Villagers might carry iron charms or wear protective herbs when travelling through wolf-haunted woods. Some regions taught children never to speak to solitary men near the forest, especially during full moons or feast days associated with pagan festivals. In certain cases, men accused of being shapeshifters were hunted down and killed, not always formally, but by neighbours who believed they were protecting the village. The connection between shape-shifting and heresy also persisted. A man who turned into a wolf was not just a beast, he was believed to have submitted himself to the devil's will. In this way, the fear of transformation became part of a broader anxiety about spiritual contamination. Just as heresy could spread through whispered teaching, so too could lycanthropy spread through cursed blood, magical belts, or even shared meat. There were no trials in most cases. Just stories. Stories that passed from one hearth to another. Stories told as warnings. Don't trust a man who walks in silence. Don't eat stew offered by a stranger in the woods. Don't follow tracks that lead into the forest if they come out shaped like boots. Because while wolves were real, werewolves were feared more. The beast outside the gate could be killed, but the beast inside the man? That was something else entirely. And yet, even more disturbing than the wolf-shaped man was the idea that evil might walk openly, unhidden, unchallenged, within the very places meant to guard against it. In the medieval imagination, the church was sacred ground. The parish church was the spiritual centre of the village, and its churchyard, hallowed by centuries of burials and prayers, was supposed to be a space protected from harm. But not all felt entirely safe there. Stories spread, quietly but persistently, that evil did not always stay outside holy boundaries. Sometimes it came cloaked, concealed, even welcomed, disguised. Demons, according to widespread belief, could assume many forms. They were not always monstrous or grotesque. In fact, the most dangerous ones often appeared perfectly human. A quiet figure at the back of the nave, a well-dressed stranger kneeling too long at the altar, a face that seemed somehow familiar and yet entirely unknown. These figures did not challenge the holy space directly. Instead, they inhabited it, lurking just enough outside the expected patterns to raise unease. Many stories describe demons appearing as travellers or penitents. They entered the churchyard at dusk, claimed to be on pilgrimage, and lingered at the graves. Some said they cried over stones that bore no name, or stood motionless until the sun disappeared. When questioned, they vanished. When ignored, illness followed. In several recorded cases, including one from a 14th century Yorkshire parish, a child was said to have touched such a figure and became mute for 3 days. The demon, said the priest, had taken the child's words as offering. The very idea that evil could enter a consecrated space unsettled people. Churchyards were where the dead awaited resurrection. They were where people were baptised, wed, and buried. But sanctity, villagers understood, did not mean immunity. Demons did not need to break into churches. They could be carried in by the sinful, the cursed, or the ignorant. A man entering with a grudge, a woman who had spoken with known heretics. Even an unbaptised child was viewed by some with suspicion, especially if they cried incessantly inside the church walls. Some chroniclers, especially monastic ones, wrote of seeing cloaked figures walking among the graves who left no footprints in snow or dew. Others described inexplicable chills during Mass, or the sound of unseen knocking from within the church crypt. One report from a German Benedictine monastery described a young novice who claimed to have seen a man kneeling backward in the pew, his face turned to the wall, but his eyes watching the congregation over his shoulder. Church authorities acknowledged the risk of spiritual intrusion. Exorcisms were not only performed in private homes or fields, but sometimes on the very grounds of churches. Holy water was sprinkled on church thresholds before Mass. Priests wore blessed amulets. Church bells, long believed to have the power to drive away evil, were rung not just to mark time, but to cleanse the air. And yet, despite all these efforts, the stories persisted. Perhaps most troubling were the tales of false clergy, demons disguised as priests. In these accounts, the impostor said the correct words, wore the proper garments, and mimicked the sacred rites. But his eyes never blinked. His shadow pointed in the wrong direction. His hands left no warmth. Parishioners would notice something only after the blessing failed to calm the sick, or the marriage ended in tragedy, or the child baptized by him was stillborn. Then the realization would come too late. The demon had not merely visited the holy place, it had presided over it. Because in the medieval worldview, evil did not always appear in the wilderness. It did not always howl or claw or burn. Sometimes it sat in silence with folded hands beneath a crucifix. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part. Because if evil could kneel in a church, then what was safe? If it could speak blessings and mimic priests, then how could a person truly guard themselves, especially when they were most vulnerable? Not in the field, nor in the forest, nor even in the church itself, but in their own bed, eyes closed, breaths slow, caught between the waking world and the shadowed realm of dreams. In the medieval imagination, sleep was not merely rest, it was risk. To sleep was to surrender. The body lay defenceless, and the soul, many believed, drifted. Dreams were not idle thoughts, they were visions, omens, visitations, sometimes divine, but just as often demonic. The night, already associated with spiritual danger, was believed to be a favoured time for evil to reach across the veil. So people protected themselves not only with prayer, but with objects, charms placed beneath the pillow, or tied near the bed to ward off nightmares and keep dark forces at bay. These charms varied by region and tradition, but their purpose was consistent, to guard the sleeper from spiritual intrusion. In many households, a small cross or rosary was placed under the bedding. Others tucked psalms or fragments of scripture into cloth pouches and laid them near the head. A commonly used verse was Psalm 91, Qui habitat in adjutorio altissimi, believed to shield against demons, plague, and bad dreams. Children especially were thought to be at risk during sleep. Mothers pinned protective tokens, small bits of iron, bone, or consecrated wax inside pillows or beneath mattresses. Some charms took the form of crude dolls or amulets made from animal teeth, feathers, or dried herbs. Rue, mugwort, and vervain were popular choices, each said to ward off evil spirits. A charm made of 9 herbs, bound with red thread and blessed on a holy day, was said to be especially effective. In some places, holy medals or relics were placed not under the pillow but above the bed, nailed to the wooden frame. These items were not decorations. They were apotropaic tools meant to turn away harm. Sleepwalkers were thought to be under the influence of wandering spirits. Nightmares, particularly those involving choking, falling, or heavy weight pressing on the chest, were interpreted as attacks by demons or hags. The infamous night hag phenomenon, what we would now recognise as sleep paralysis, was explained through the lens of spiritual assault, and so protection was necessary. Even bedding itself could be imbued with meaning. In parts of rural England and Ireland, it was customary to wash bed linens in blessed water on certain feast days, particularly around Easter and All Saints. A thread pulled from a priest's cassock was believed to offer protection if sewn into a pillow's hem. The act of turning one's pillow before sleeping, flipping it to the clean side, was considered a small ritual to avoid bad dreams or restless spirits. Some practices were inherited orally, passed down through generations. A grandmother might whisper to a child to never sleep with their head facing the door, or to avoid sleeping with their hands crossed over their chest, a posture too similar to the grave. Others were more elaborate. Dream-catching bowls filled with herbs placed under the bed, or bowls of salt at each corner of the room. It was not the object alone that held power, but the combination of belief, ritual, and repetition. The Church acknowledged some of these practices with cautious tolerance. It promoted nightly prayers and the use of scripture, but discouraged charms that strayed too far from official doctrine. Still, many priests quietly accepted the presence of protective items in homes, particularly when they were combined with piety and confession. The line between superstition and folk piety was, as always, thin. In a time when dreams could foretell death, and sleep was a passage as much as a rest, people used what they had, scripture, herb, thread, or stone, to keep the darkness at bay. Because even in the safety of one's own bed, sleep was never entirely safe. And so people did not drift to it casually. They prepared for it, ritually, deliberately, with gestures shaped by centuries of fear and faith. Central to this nightly preparation was the hearth, the fire at the heart of the home. In the medieval world, the hearth was more than a cooking space or a source of warmth. It was a symbol of life, protection, and spiritual boundary. And as night fell, it became the focal point of domestic rituals meant to guard not only the body, but the soul. Long after the evening meal, when the pots had been scrubbed and the spoons wiped clean, families would gather near the fading coals. The fire was not left to die entirely. To let it go out was considered dangerous. not only because reigniting it could be laborious, but because fire was believed to be a divine gift, a presence that kept evil at bay. Letting the hearth grow cold before morning was a sign of neglect, both physical and spiritual. A common practice across much of Europe was the covering of the fire with ashes, a method known as banking or smoring. This reduced the flame to a slow, safe smoulder, which could be stirred back to life come morning. But the act was rarely silent. In many households, especially in Celtic regions, the fire was banked with prayer. A Scottish Gaelic smoring charm, recorded centuries later from oral tradition, asked for protection from the eye of evil and invoked the Trinity to guard the house. Each sweep of ash was accompanied by words, gestures and signs of the cross. In other regions, especially among the deeply pious, families would recite nighttime prayers aloud while seated around the hearth. The Lord's Prayer was common, as were portions of the Psalms. Children were encouraged to ask for the protection of their guardian angels. Older members of the household might whisper the names of the recently dead, asking for peace for them and for those still living. The fire, glowing softly in the dark, offered a kind of reassurance. Its light was associated with Christ, its warmth with the breath of life. A healthy hearth signified a house rightly ordered, spiritually vigilant, domestically stable. It was not unusual for travellers to judge the safety of an inn or stranger's cottage by the state of its hearth at night. A cold or neglected fire was a warning. Superstitions mingled with faith. It was believed that spirits and demons hated flame. A strong fire near the bedchamber could deter night terrors or keep shapeless things from slipping beneath the door. Some households placed embers near cradles or animals' stalls to ensure protection through the night. On certain feast days or saints' eves, particularly All Hallows or Candlemas, the hearth fire was relit with blessed candles or carried flame from the church, symbolising divine presence in the home. The hearth also marked a threshold. In some traditions, people placed offerings, crumbs of bread, drops of ale, sprigs of herbs, at the hearth before bed. These were not just symbolic gestures of gratitude. In areas where folk belief persisted alongside Christian practice, these small tokens were meant to appease household spirits or the dead. To fail to do so, especially on certain nights of the year, was thought to invite misfortune. Children were taught early that the fire was to be respected. Not just because it could burn, but because it could protect. A mother might tell her child that the fire would watch over you while you sleep, and for many that was a literal belief. The living flame was a ward, a silent, glowing guardian. But the fire needed tending. Without care, it could fade. Without reverence, it could be offended. Without prayer, it was just warmth. With it, it became part of a nightly ritual rooted in both necessity and belief. Because when the doors were barred and the shutters drawn, and the outside world had turned to shadow, the hearth remained. A small flickering light against the dark. And yet, even that glow, constant though it might be, could not entirely chase away the fear that sleep brought. For medieval people, to close one's eyes was never merely an act of rest. It was a moment of surrender, a yielding of control, a drifting of soul, a state so closely linked to death that the two were often spoken of in the same breath. Sleep was necessary, but it was never fully trusted. In a world haunted by superstition, illness and spiritual anxiety, rest could be as feared as dying itself. The language of the time reflects this deep unease. In Latin texts and early vernacular prayers, sleep and death were treated as kin, somnus and mors, one a cousin to the other. Sleep, it was believed, made the soul vulnerable to attack. While the body lay motionless, spirits might approach, demons might intrude, or dreams might reveal terrifying truths. Some theologians even debated whether the soul partially left the body during sleep, wandering into the dream world where it could be tempted, misled, or even stolen. People feared what might happen during sleep, but they also feared not waking from it. Sudden, unexplained deaths in the night were common. A person seen healthy in the evening might be found cold by morning. In the absence of medical understanding, these events were often attributed to spiritual causes. A demon pressing on the chest, a witch stealing breath, or God reclaiming a soul in judgment. The good death, dying with confession, sacraments and prayer, was impossible if one died unaware in sleep. Thus, some feared sleeping too deeply or without first making peace with God. This anxiety led to widespread protective rituals. People crossed themselves before bed. They whispered prayers, recited psalms, or clutched blessed objects beneath the covers. Some went so far as to sleep in a particular position, on their right side, facing east, symbolically aligning themselves with the rising sun and the resurrection. It was not merely habit, it was defense. Nightmares were viewed not just as disturbing images, but as real threats. They could be signs of spiritual unrest, divine warnings, or demonic assaults. Sleep paralysis in particular inspired dread. Known by many names, the night hag, the witch's ride, elf pressure, it was described as a sensation of being crushed, held down, or choked while unable to cry out. Those who suffered from it often believed they had been attacked by spirits in the night, and so they feared returning to sleep lest it happen again. Some individuals, especially those already marked as different, were believed to be more vulnerable to nocturnal danger. The unbaptized, the excommunicated, women who had recently given birth, or those mourning a fresh death, each was seen as especially exposed. It was believed that spirits might be drawn to them in the night, either to torment or to lure away. A new mother might sleep with protective herbs beneath her pillow. A grieving husband might leave a candle burning through the night beside the bed. Even dreams themselves were feared. While some were welcomed as visions or divine guidance, particularly when they involved saints or angelic figures, others were believed to be sent by demons to deceive or tempt. A dream that revealed hidden knowledge could be viewed as a blessing or a curse, depending on who received it. Church authorities cautioned against trusting dreams too easily, warning that Satan could disguise himself even as an angel of light. Fear of sleep was compounded during periods of widespread illness. During plague years, the line between sleep and death blurred completely. The infected often died in their beds, alone and unconscious. Their sleep became a symbol of helplessness, their beds a kind of pre-grave. It was not uncommon for survivors to burn the bedded, believing it to be cursed or spiritually tainted. In short, sleep was not peace, it was peril. The medieval world did not view rest as something to be embraced blindly. It was approached carefully, surrounded by rituals, and treated with suspicion. Because when one slept, the world continued without you. Spirits moved, dreams whispered, demons waited, and there was no guarantee that you would wake. Worse still was waking only to find that the nightmare hadn't ended. In the medieval world, the boundary between sleep and waking, between dream and reality, was not as firm as modern minds might assume. To dream of death, of demons, or of dark omens was not merely unsettling. It was often considered a form of experience. What was seen in dreams could shape the decisions, fears, and behaviours of entire households. And in a culture that wove the supernatural into everyday life, belief alone could give dreams real power. People believed that dreams could foretell illness, accidents, or death. If someone dreamt of falling teeth, bloodied water, or a cloaked figure beckoning, it might be interpreted as a warning. This wasn't idle speculation, it could prompt genuine action. A person might visit a priest for confession, delay travel, or avoid a specific place or person altogether. In this way, the dream's influence extended far beyond sleep. It became a lived reality. Many dreams were treated as messages, not from the subconscious, as modern psychology would argue, but from spiritual sources. The divine might speak through dreams, as in biblical accounts of Joseph or Daniel, but so too might devils, tempting or tormenting the soul under cover of sleep. In both cases, the dream was a site of influence. It could not be ignored. To do so risked missing a warning or falling into sin. This belief was reinforced by physical sensation. Sleep paralysis, night terrors, even common ailments like fever dreams or insomnia blurred the line between the internal and external. A person might wake feeling as though they had truly fought something in the night. They might feel drained, bruised, or marked. If a woman dreamed of being attacked and woke with scratches or pain, it wasn't uncommon for her to report an actual demonic encounter, and the community might believe her. These fears were not simply products of imagination. They were shaped by centuries of religious teaching, local folklore, and social memory. In a time when cause and effect were not always clear and when few understood the mechanics of the mind, Dreams filled in the gaps. They offered explanations, and explanations, even frightening ones, brought order to chaos. The Church did not outright reject the importance of dreams. Some visions, it admitted, could be divine in origin. Saints were said to appear to the faithful in sleep. Martyrs gave warnings. Angels delivered guidance. Monastic records are full of accounts where holy men and women received messages in dreams. But the Church also warned that dreams could deceive. Satan, it taught, was a master of illusion. He could appear as a friend, a priest, even Christ himself. Thus, discerning the source of a dream became a serious matter, especially for those in religious life. Ordinary villagers, however, lacked theological training. Interpretation often came through shared stories and folk knowledge. A widow dreaming of her dead husband standing at the door might believe he was calling her to join him. A mother dreaming of a river sweeping away her child might keep the child home from the river for days. Entire families might alter behaviour based on one person's troubled dream. And once fear took root, it could be hard to shake. A dream believed deeply enough could produce symptoms in waking life. Exhaustion, fever, hallucinations. Physicians sometimes diagnosed such conditions as melancholy or vapours, but many saw the spiritual cause as more pressing. A confessor might be called, holy water sprinkled, charms placed under the pillow or bed. The body was affected, but so was the soul. The cure, therefore, had to address both. Ultimately, the line between dream and reality wasn't a line at all. It was a threshold, thin, shifting, and constantly crossed. And once belief passed through it, fear became fact. The dream that warned of death could cause death if the fear it planted was deep enough. The vision of a demon could become a real tormentor if no one said otherwise. Because in a world shaped by signs and symbols, it didn't matter whether the danger was imagined or material. If it felt real, it was. And so we return to the quiet of the medieval night. The fire has dimmed, the prayers have been said, doors are latched, shutters drawn, charms tucked under pillows, and the floor swept clean of ashes and worries. In the hush that follows, what remains is a world half asleep, half afraid. Because for all their rituals and remedies, medieval people knew that the night was never fully theirs. It belonged to other things, too. To sounds that couldn't be explained, to dreams that felt too vivid, to spirits that might slip through cracks in the walls or linger at the foot of the bed. But it also belonged to warmth, to faith, to family, to the routines passed down not through books but through gestures repeated until they became habit. The way a mother banked the hearth with ash, whispering protective verses as she smoothed the embers. The way a child clutched a carved charm or a folded scrap of parchment, believing it to be a shield. The way an old man paused at the door to mark it with his thumb and murmur a blessing before turning in for the night. These acts, small, ordinary, were not just superstitions. They were expressions of care, of hope, of a desire to hold back the unknown, even for one more night. Because when life was short, when death was sudden, and when answers were few, it made sense to be cautious, to prepare, to believe. And belief, for all its terrors, also brought comfort. If a dream could be a warning, it could also be a message from a loved one. If a cold touch in the dark could be a demon, it might also be a guardian. If a candle flickered without wind, maybe it was the Virgin Mary drawing near. Fear and comfort lived side by side, shaped by the same beliefs, filtered through the same worldview. The medieval mind did not divide the world cleanly into sacred and profane, real and unreal, safe and dangerous. It was all mixed together, hearth smoke and holy water, whispers and scripture, ghosts and saints, and perhaps in its own way, that brought a certain peace. Not certainty, but understanding. Not control, but ritual, because every community had its own stories, every household had its own customs, and every individual, from child to elder, played a part in keeping the night at bay. The very act of believing, of preparing, of watching the flame gave people a way to push back against helplessness. It turned darkness into something known, even if that knowledge came in the form of myths, omens, and quiet, uneasy prayers. Today we might look back and call these ideas strange. We might smile at the idea of corpse candles or smothering spirits, shake our heads at dreams that foretold death or demons disguised in the churchyard. But in truth, these beliefs were not so far removed from our own quiet rituals. Checking locks before bed, leaving the hallway light on, sleeping better when a loved one is near. Fear still lingers in the dark, and comfort still lives in the things we do to feel safe. For medieval people, night was not just a time of rest, it was a passage, a journey from one day to the next, always uncertain, always half-shadowed. And yet they crossed it again and again with hands folded in prayer, with herbs tucked beneath cloth, with fire glowing in the grate, and stories whispered to children who dared ask, what was that sound? It was a world shaped by fear, yes, but also by resilience, because no matter how loud the owl cried from the roof, how heavy the air felt at midnight, or how long the dog howled outside the cottage wall, people still slept, still dreamed. Still woke with the rooster's crow and faced the day ahead. The night might belong to spirits, but the morning always belonged to the living, and so they continued, one night at a time, layering fears with prayers, shadows with stories, superstition with habit, holding fast to each other, to their saints, to the firelight that flickered like memory on the walls, not because they had conquered fear, but because they had learned to live beside it. Good night.